The wallpaper in the second-floor hallway still had the faint, unfaded rectangles where my family had lived for 40 years. They were pale cream shapes against a backdrop of aged, water-spotted floral paper. Ghosts of frames that had held my wedding to Curtis, Mitchell's high school graduation, and the black and white portrait of my own mother holding a silver spoon. Now, those rectangles were being rolled over with a thick, odor-free latex paint. Cheryl called the color muted linen. "It's about visual weight, Lorraine," Cheryl said, her voice carrying that pleasant clinical rhythm she used when she was managing a project. She didn't look back at me from the second step of the stepladder. She was wearing a pair of clean white linen trousers that somehow never seemed to gather dust or paint splatters. The dark frames just pull the ceiling down. In a narrow space like this, you want the eye to travel upward, not get snagged on the past. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting on the smooth oak banister. My husband, Curtis, had spent 3 weeks sanding that banister down when Mitchell was a toddler to make sure there wouldn't be a single splinter for small hands to catch. "The frames are cherry wood," I said. My voice was quiet, a habit left over from my 30 years as a middle school library assistant. Curtis made them in the basement. Cheryl paused, her roller hovering an inch from the wall. She didn't sigh, but her shoulders dropped, perhaps half an inch, a calculated sign of patience. "And we've saved them, Lorraine. They're downstairs in the dry storage, wrapped in bubble wrap. But modern interiors need room to breathe. Mitchell agrees. He says the hallway always felt like a tunnel." Mitchell had never said that to me. But then Mitchell rarely spoke to me about the house anymore. 5 years ago, after Curtis died of the pulmonary fibrosis that slowly took his breath night by night, the bills had become a mountain I couldn't climb alone. The roof needed $30,000 of copper flashing and slate repair. The boiler in the basement rattled like an old iron coal car. Mitchell, my only child, had sat at my kitchen table, rubbed his temples, and suggested a solution that seemed reasonable at the time. He and Cheryl would buy the house from me for the remaining balance of the mortgage. They would remodel, and I would move into the garden apartment downstairs, the walkout basement we'd finished years ago for Curtis's mother, though she had never lived long enough to use it. It had felt like a victory then. I would stay in my home, close to my grandson, Leo. But a house, I have learned, does not belong to the person who paid for the lumber. It belongs to the person who holds the brush. "I can put them in my sitting room downstairs," I murmured. "Of course," Cheryl said, her roller resuming its steady, textured hiss-shuck against the drywall. "Though you really don't want to clutter those small walls either, sweetie. It makes the light disappear." She called me sweetie when she was being particularly firm. It was a term of endearment that felt like offense. I looked down at the cardboard box sitting near my feet. Inside, nestled between sheets of old newspaper, were 50 years of my life. There was a photograph of Mitchell when he was 6, his front teeth missing, holding a small yellow perch he'd caught in the creek behind the library. There was Curtis on our 35th anniversary, wearing a tie that was slightly crooked because his hands had already begun to shake from the illness. At the very bottom of the box was the smallest frame, a silver-plated oval. Inside was a portrait of Mitchell's grandmother, a woman who had worked 32 years at the Heinz canning plant, her fingers permanently stained slightly yellow from the vinegar and brine. A woman can spend 30 years building a home only to realize she was never allowed to rest inside it. The bricks remain, but the warmth is traded for something cleaner, something easier to wipe down. The front door opened and the cool autumn air swept into the foyer, bringing the smell of damp oak leaves and the exhaust of Mitchell's SUV. "Mom?" Mitchell's voice was loud, carrying the heavy timbre of his father's, but without the slow cadence Curtis had used. Mitchell was always in a hurry, even when he had nowhere to go. "Leo, keep your boots on the mat. Don't bring the mud in." "I have my leaf!" Leo's voice was high, thin, and bright. He was 6, with the deep-set gray eyes of my husband's family, eyes that looked too old for his small, round face. He scrambled past his father, his yellow slicker swishing. "Grandma!" he called out, spotting me at the base of the stairs. He held up a maple leaf that had turned the color of dried blood. "Look, I found the biggest one!" "It's beautiful, Leo," I said, kneeling down so I was at his eye level. My knees made a dry, cracking sound that none of them noticed. "That's from the sugar maple by the old well house. The ones on the south side always turn first." "Can we press it in the big dictionary?" he asked, his eyes wide. We had pressed 5 leaves the week before, using the heavy 3-volume Webster's Curtis had bought at an estate sale in 1984. "We can," I started, but Cheryl's voice drifted down from the ladder. "Leo, go wash your hands first, please, and put your leaf on the porch table. We don't want the dry bits crumbling on the rug." Leo's face fell slightly, the bright curiosity in his eyes dulling just a fraction. It was a look I knew well. It was the same look Mitchell used to get when Curtis told him he couldn't go to the creek until his algebra homework was finished. But Mitchell had grown up to be a man who avoided conflict by simply becoming invisible in his own home. "Go on, Leo," Mitchell said, coming into the hall and setting his briefcase on the cherry sideboard, the one piece of furniture Cheryl hadn't replaced yet, though she had covered it with a long runner of gray linen to hide the watermark left by my fern 5 years ago. He didn't look at the walls. He didn't look at the white paint covering the spot where his own face, age 12 in a Little League uniform, had hung for 25 years. "Mitchell," I said quietly, standing up, "did you want to keep the frame with your father's fishing license, the one from the cabin?" Mitchell stopped, his hand still on his briefcase. He looked at the box at my feet, then quickly up at the wall where the white paint was still wet. He glanced at Cheryl's back, then back down at the floor. "We have the digital copies, Mom," he said, his voice flat, the tone he used when he wanted to close a discussion before it became an argument. "Cheryl scanned everything last spring, remember? It's all on the drive. We can look at them on the tablet whenever we want." "A screen isn't the same as a wall, Mitchell," I said. "It's cleaner," he replied, and for a second his eyes lingered on the cherry sideboard where the gray runner was slightly crooked. It's less to dust, and we're trying to simplify things." He reached out and patted my shoulder. It was a quick, dry touch, the kind of gesture you give an old dog that's blocking the doorway. Then he walked into the kitchen, his boots clicking on the new bamboo flooring that had replaced our old, scratched pine. I stood there alone with the box. From the top of the ladder, Cheryl didn't say a word. She just shifted her weight, the wood of the steps creaking slightly under her white shoes, and dipped her roller into the tray once more. That night in the garden apartment, the silence was different. Above me, I could hear the muffled, rhythmic thud of their lives, the heavy stride of Mitchell walking to the refrigerator, the light, quick step of Cheryl setting the table, and the occasional sharp, muffled laughter of Leo. Down here the air was cooler, smelled slightly of the stone foundation and the lavender sachets I kept in my dresser drawers to fight the damp. I sat in the armchair Curtis had bought me for our silver anniversary. On the small side table next to me, I had placed 3 of the frames I'd taken from the box before Cheryl could tape it shut. One was Curtis, squinting into the sun on the shore of Lake Erie, his gray hair wild from the wind. One was Mitchell as a baby, his face small and round, tucked into a flannel blanket I had knitted myself, a blanket that had since been lost during one of Cheryl's seasonal Goodwill donations. And the third was the empty space on the wall upstairs where they had been. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house settle. When the pipes groaned, I knew exactly which valve was sticking. When the floorboards creaked upstairs, I knew Mitchell was walking past the linen closet to check on Leo. But for the first time in 40 years, I realized that my knowledge of this house was like the knowledge of a language no one else spoke. I was the only one left who knew why the third step from the bottom squeaked, or why the pantry door wouldn't stay closed unless you lifted the brass handle just a fraction of an inch. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft, hesitant knock on my door, the one that opened into the small utility room near the dryer. I stood up, my joints stiff, and turned on the small lamp with the yellowed silk shade. When I opened the door, Leo was standing there in his flannel pajamas. His feet were bare, and his hair was messy from where he'd been lying down. In his hand, he held a small, green, plastic dinosaur with a broken tail. "Grandma," he whispered, looking back over his shoulder toward the basement stairs, "why did Mom put the pictures of Grandpa in the dark?" I looked at Leo's bare feet on the cold linoleum of my utility room floor. The skin of his toes was pink, and he was curling them against the draft that always slipped under the door from the garage. "Come here, sweet pea," I whispered, reaching out to pull him onto the small braided rug by my armchair. I didn't want to answer his question directly. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to carry the weight of an adult's desire for a clean slate. "Your feet are like ice cubes. Why aren't you wearing your slippers?" "I couldn't find them," he said, climbing into my lap with the ease of a child who had done it 1,000 times, though lately those times were becoming rare. His small body was warm, smelling of the lavender soap I bought for him and the strawberry toothpaste Cheryl insisted was better for his enamel. He held up the green triceratops. "His tail fell off in the sandbox. Daddy said we have to throw him away now." "We don't have to throw him away," I said, taking the toy. "We just need some of your grandfather's wood glue. It works on plastic if you let it sit overnight. We'll put a rubber band around it to hold it tight." Leo looked at the 3 frames on my side table. His finger went to the glass over Curtis's face. "Is Grandpa in the box upstairs?" "No, Leo. Grandpa is, well, he's in our minds, but the pictures of him are just sleeping in a safe place for a little while." "Why doesn't Mommy want them on the wall?" The honesty of children is a quiet razor. They see the shifts in a household long before the adults have finished drafting their excuses. "Your Mommy wants the house to look very nice and bright," I said, keeping my voice even, though my chest felt tight. "Sometimes when people move into a house, they need to make it feel like theirs. When your grandpa and I bought this place 40 years ago, we painted the kitchen 3 times before we liked it." "But it was already your house," Leo said simply. Before I could answer, the door at the top of the basement stairs clicked open. The light from the kitchen hallway cut a sharp yellow wedge down the dark wooden steps. "Leo?" Mitchell's voice called down, his tone sharp with that specific kind of parental panic that is actually just exhaustion. "Leo, are you down there?" "I'm with Grandma, Daddy," Leo called back, not moving from my lap. I heard Mitchell's footsteps, heavy, slightly uneven because of a knee injury he'd gotten in college, descending the stairs. When he reached the bottom, he paused in the doorway of my sitting room. He was still wearing his work trousers, but his tie was gone, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. He looked at us, his eyes immediately dropping to Leo's bare feet, then to the 3 frames on my table, and finally to me. "Mom, you can't let him come down here without slippers," Mitchell said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired, the kind of tired that makes every small detail feel like an obstacle. "The floor is too cold. Cheryl's been looking for him. She thought he was in his room." "He just wanted to fix his dinosaur, Mitchell," I said gently. "I was about to bring him back up." Mitchell sighed, stepping into the room. It was a small space, crowded with the things I couldn't part with. My sewing machine, the pine bookcase Curtis had built from the scraps of the well house roof, and the 2 wingback chairs that had once lived in our family room. Compared to the airy, minimalist spaces Cheryl had created upstairs, my apartment felt like a crowded antique shop. I knew they both thought of it that way, even if they never said it. "Come on, Bud," Mitchell said, reaching down to lift Leo from my lap. "It's past 9. You have school tomorrow." Leo clung to my neck for a second longer than usual, his small fingers digging into my collarbone. "Grandma's going to glue his tail," he muttered into his father's shoulder. "We'll see," Mitchell said. He looked at me, his expression softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained guarded. "Sorry, Mom. She's had a long day. The painters are coming back tomorrow to do the baseboards, and she's trying to get everything prepped." "It's fine, Mitchell," I said, standing up to smooth my skirt. "I understand. A new house takes a lot of work." "It's not a new house," Mitchell said, almost to himself. He looked at the bookcase behind me, his finger tracing the edge of a shelf where a small nick from his own childhood bicycle handlebar still showed in the wood. For a second, he looked like the boy who used to hide behind the furnace when he was in trouble. Then he shook his head, as if clearing away a cobweb, and turned toward the stairs. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Mitchell. Tell Cheryl I left the clean kitchen towels on the dryer." He didn't reply, his footsteps disappearing up the stairs, followed by the soft, solid click of the door at the top. A child doesn't need a digital file to remember who built the porch they sit on. They only need to see the shape of the hand that held them. But adults are different. Adults believe that if you hide the evidence of the past, you can rewrite the present. The next morning, I went up to the kitchen at 7, as I always did, to help get Leo ready for school. It was a quiet arrangement we'd made when they first moved in. I would make the school lunches and do the light laundry, and in exchange, I felt like I was still earning my keep. The kitchen was cold. The white oak cabinets Curtis had custom built were gone now, replaced by flat front, handleless gray cupboards that opened with a push lathe. The room smelled of fresh paint and lavender-scented granite cleaner. Cheryl was standing at the island, typing on her laptop, while a sleek chrome espresso machine hissed in the corner. She didn't look up when I entered, but she smiled, that quick professional curve of the lips she used when she was addressing a client. "Morning, Lorraine," she said, her fingers clicking rapidly on the keys. "There's some oatmeal in the pantry if you want. We're doing a gluten-free grain bowl this morning for Leo, so you don't need to worry about his lunch. I've ordered a meal service for him. It gets delivered to the school." I stopped with my hand on the handle of the refrigerator. For 3 years, I had made Leo's sandwich every morning. I knew he liked the crust cut off, but only on the sides, not the top, and that he wanted his apple slices sprinkled with cinnamon so they wouldn't turn brown before noon. "A meal service?" I asked, my voice sounding thin even to me. "It's just easier," Cheryl said, still looking at her screen. "They balance the macros, it's all organic, and it saves us so much time in the morning. Mitchell was always rushing to get the bag out the door." "I never minded making it," I said. "Oh, I know, sweetie," Cheryl said, finally closing her laptop and looking at me. Her expression was entirely kind, which made the words feel even heavier. "But we really want you to be able to just relax. You've spent your whole life taking care of people. It's time for you to just enjoy your retirement. We don't want you to feel like you have to work for your room and board." There was a silence then, the kind of silence that has a physical weight to it. The espresso machine gave a final wet gasp and went quiet. She was telling me, in the most polite way possible, that my services were no longer required. "I see," I said. I turned to go back downstairs, but before I reached the basement door, Cheryl spoke again. "Oh, Lorraine, one more thing. The painters are going to do the utility room next week. We're going to turn that little area by your door into a mudroom for Leo's sports gear. We'll need to move that big cedar chest of Curtis's, the one with his old coats." I froze, with my hand on the doorknob. The cedar chest had been Curtis's grandfather's. It was where we kept the heavy wool blankets we only used when the wind off the river got so cold the window panes rattled. "Where are you going to put it?" I asked, not turning around. "We thought the garage," Cheryl said, "under the tarp. It's just taking up so much space down there. And since you don't really use those old coats anymore, well, it's just sitting there, isn't it?" I spent the rest of that afternoon in the utility room, sitting on a low plastic footstool in front of the cedar chest. The chest was heavy, made of solid 3/4-inch red cedar that Curtis's grandfather had salvaged from a collapsed barn in Somerset County. When you opened the lid, the scent of the wood was still sharp and clean, a sudden wall of forest air that defied the damp concrete smell of the basement. Inside were the blankets we had used to survive the winter of 1977, when the blizzard had cut the power for 6 days, and we had slept in 3 layers of wool in front of the stone fireplace upstairs. There was Curtis's red and black plaid hunting jacket, the wool stiff and heavy, smelling faintly of the pipe tobacco he had given up 30 years ago. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a yellowed pillowcase, were Mitchell's baby blankets, the ones my mother had crocheted with small, uneven blue borders. I smoothed my hand over the rough wool of Curtis's jacket. It is easier to move a heavy box than to carry the silence of why you are moving it. We treat the belongings of the dead like dead things, forgetting that to those who survived, they are the only things still holding their shape. If you move them to the garage, the damp will find them, the moths will find them. Within 2 seasons, the wood will swell and the hinges will rust, and then it will be easy for Cheryl to say, "Well, it's ruined now, Lorraine. We might as well let the junk haulers take it." It was a slow, polite execution of history. On Saturday morning, I heard Mitchell's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. He was wearing his old gray sweatshirt with the torn cuffs and a pair of stained cargo shorts. He didn't look at me when he entered the utility room. He looked at the chest. "Hey, Mom," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Cheryl said we should get this moved before the painters get here on Monday. I bought some heavy-duty contractor bags to wrap the blankets in." "The garage is damp, Mitchell," I said. My voice was level, almost conversational. "You know the north corner near the old coal chute still leaks when we get a hard rain from the east." "I'll put a tarp over it, Mom," he said, his voice rising just a fraction in pitch, the tone he used when he was trying to convince himself of something. "It'll be fine. It's only temporary until we get the mudroom cabinets put in. Then we can figure out a permanent spot for it." Temporary. In this house, temporary had a way of becoming permanent. The old clawfoot tub in the upstairs bathroom had been temporarily disconnected 3 years ago. Now it was sitting in the side yard, filled with Cheryl's creeping ivy. "Let me help you empty it first," I said. "The blankets shouldn't be in the garage, even in plastic. I'll find room for them under my bed." "Mom, you don't have room under your bed," Mitchell said. But he didn't stop me as I knelt down and began lifting the heavy wool out of the chest. We worked in silence for a few minutes. Mitchell took the hunting jacket from me, his fingers lingering for a second on the wool sleeve. He looked at the horn buttons Curtis had sewn on himself with thick black thread. For a moment his face looked soft, the tight line of his jaw relaxing. "Dad wore this when we went up to Clarion," Mitchell said quietly, "the year I got my first buck." "He did," I said. "He froze his toes that morning because he gave you his extra pair of wool socks." Mitchell let out a small, dry sound that might have been a laugh if his mouth hadn't remained so tight. I forgot about that. "He didn't," I said. "He talked about that trip every November until his lungs went." At the bottom of the chest, beneath the baby blankets, my fingers brushed against something hard and flat. It was a small oblong cigar box, an old Dutch master's box that had belonged to Curtis. I lifted it out. The cardboard was soft at the corners, smelling of old paper and copper. "What's that?" Mitchell asked, leaning over the cedar rim. I opened the lid. Inside were 3 small leather-bound ledger books. They weren't diaries. They were Curtis's household logs. From the year we bought the house in 1978 until his stroke in 2019, Curtis had recorded every single penny that entered and left this home. I picked up the first one from 1982 and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was neat, slanted, and tiny, the hand of a man who had been trained by draftspersons. October 14th, milk, $1.89. Nails for porch, $4.50. Mitchell's winter coat, Sears, $22. At the bottom of every page, there was a small section labeled Savings/Overtime. October 28th, overtime shift, mill, $64. Placed in Mitchell's college fund. Total, $412. Mitchell reached out and took the book from my hand. He stared at the page, his thumb brushing against his father's handwriting. He didn't speak. I watched his eyes move down the column of numbers, down the list of small sacrifices. $5 here, $12 there, all funneled into the account that had eventually paid for his engineering degree at Penn State. "He never told me he took overtime for my coat," Mitchell whispered. "He took overtime for everything, Mitchell," I said. "He didn't want you to feel the pinch of the mill. He wanted you to think the world was wide open." The silence in the utility room grew thick, filled only with the hum of the water heater in the corner. Mitchell stood there, holding his father's ledger, his shoulders slightly hunched. It was the first time in months I had seen him look like my son, rather than Cheryl's husband. Then, from the top of the stairs, the door opened. "Mitchell?" Cheryl's voice was clear, carrying that bright, efficient chime. "The contractor is on the phone. He wants to know if we want the satin finish or the eggshell for the mudroom benches. Can you come up?" Mitchell blinked, his head jerking toward the stairs. He looked down at the ledger in his hand, then at me. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. "Go on," I said quietly. "Don't keep her waiting." He hesitated, then set the ledger back into the Dutch master's box. He didn't put it in his pocket. He didn't ask to keep it. He just laid it back on top of the baby blankets, turned, and went up the stairs, 2 at a time. I sat there on my plastic stool for a long time, the cold from the concrete floor seeping through my shoes. I didn't put the ledger back in the chest. I kept it in my lap. I knew that if I left it there, by Monday it would be in a contractor bag in the garage, and by next winter the pages would be stuck together with black mold. When Mitchell came back down 20 minutes later, his face was different. The softness was gone, replaced by that hurried, slightly annoyed mask he wore when he had too many things on his list. "Okay," he said, not looking at me. "Let's get this thing moved. Cheryl wants the space cleared before she goes to the grocery store." He gripped one end of the heavy cedar chest. I didn't offer to help him carry it. My back was too tired, and my heart was too heavy. I stood by the door and held it open as he backed out into the cold, gray light of the garage, the wooden bottom of the chest scraping against the concrete with a sound like a low, dull scream. As he set it down on the damp floor of the garage, right beneath the corner of the roof, where the paint was already peeling from the water damage, he didn't look at the sky to see if it was going to rain. He just pulled a blue plastic tarp over it and weighted the corners down with 4 old bricks from the garden. "There," he said, wiping his hands on his shorts. "That should hold it." He didn't look at me as he walked back inside. But when I went back into my kitchen to make a cup of tea, I noticed something on the small wooden table by my door. It was the silver-plated oval frame, the one of Mitchell's grandmother, the woman who had worked the Heinz plant for 32 years. Cheryl had placed it there. Next to it was a small printed Post-it note in her neat, rounded handwriting. "Lorraine, found this in the box. We really don't have a place for this style upstairs. Thought you'd want it in your space. XX." I set the silver-plated oval frame on my dresser, right next to the small porcelain dish where I kept Curtis's wedding band and my own. The woman in the photograph was Denise, Mitchell's grandmother. In the picture, taken in 1964, she was wearing her good Sunday dress, the navy blue one with the small white polka dots. But her hands were tucked slightly behind her hips. She had done that because she was ashamed of her fingernails. No matter how hard she scrubbed with the yellow lye soap after her shifts at the canning plant, The vinegar and the beet juice had worked their way into the quick of her skin. She had died in a crowded ward at St. Margaret's Hospital when Mitchell was 3. Nobody in the family spoke of her much anymore, except when I made her recipe for cabbage rolls at Christmas. Her life had been a long, quiet series of winter mornings, steam-heated rooms, and the smell of hot brine. Now her face was down here in the dark with me. The most painful kind of exclusion doesn't come with a locked door. It comes with a third chair that stays tucked under the table. Around 5:30 that evening, the smell of roasted rosemary and garlic began to drift down through the floorboards. It was a beautiful smell, warm and rich, the kind that makes a house feel like a sanctuary. I knew Cheryl was making her rosemary chicken, the one she had learned from a cooking blog, which required 4 hours of marinating and a special cast-iron skillet Curtis had bought for me at a hardware store in Ohio 30 years ago. I had always helped with Sunday dinner. For decades, Sunday was the day the kitchen belonged to both of us, first to Curtis and me, and then, as Curtis grew weaker, to Mitchell and me. Even after Mitchell married, I had still been the one to peel the potatoes, to make sure the gravy didn't lump, to whip the cream for the pie. I smoothed my apron, washed my hands, and took the small ceramic garlic press from my drawer, the one Cheryl had asked to borrow the week before. I walked up the basement stairs, my slippers making no sound on the wood. The kitchen was bright. Cheryl had turned on the under-cabinet LED strips, casting a clean white light across the quartz countertops. Mitchell was standing by the sink, pouring a bottle of red wine into a glass decanter. Leo was sitting at the island, kicking his heels against the bar stools, drawing on a piece of construction paper. The table in the dining room was already set. I stopped at the threshold. There were 3 placemats, 3 forks, 3 water glasses. The gray linen napkins were folded into neat, sharp triangles on top of the 3 gray plates. "Grandma!" Leo called out, his pencil dropping. "Look! I drew a dinosaur with a big tail, a red one." "It's lovely, Leo," I said, my voice staying steady through sheer habit. I looked at the table, then at Cheryl, who was taking the chicken out of the oven. Her face was flushed from the heat, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears. "Oh, the rain," Cheryl said, setting the heavy skillet on a trivet. She didn't look startled to see me. Her smile was immediate and perfectly warm. "You brought the garlic press. Thank you so much. I was just about to send Mitchell down to get it." "The table looks nice, Cheryl," I said. "Thanks," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "We're having that rosemary chicken. I know you've been saying your acid reflux has been acting up lately with garlic, so we thought we'd save you the trouble of having to navigate it. I left some of the vegetable broth and crackers from yesterday in your fridge down there." "I see," I said. Mitchell didn't look at me. He was very focused on the wine decanter, watching the dark liquid flow through the glass neck as if it were a delicate laboratory experiment. His knuckles were white where he gripped the bottle. "Why isn't there a plate for Grandma?" Leo asked. He looked from his drawing to the dining room table, his brow furrowing. "Grandma always eats Sunday chicken." "Grandma has her own kitchen downstairs now, Leo," Cheryl said. Her voice was patient, the tone she used when she was explaining why we don't touch the stove. "We've talked about this. It's like she has her own little apartment. We have to respect her privacy. Sometimes grown-ups want their own quiet space to eat." "But Grandma's not a grown-up," Leo muttered, his voice dropping. "She's Grandma." "Go wash your hands, Leo," Mitchell said. His voice was louder than it needed to be, cracking slightly at the end. "The chicken is getting cold. Go on." Leo looked at me, his gray eyes wide and troubled. I gave him a small, reassuring nod, and he slid down from the stool, his sneakers squeaking on the bamboo floor as he ran down the hall. "I'll leave the press here," I said, setting the small ceramic tool on the very edge of the quartz island. "Thanks, sweetie," Cheryl said. She had already picked up the carving knife. "Have a quiet evening down there. Let us know if you need anything." "Good night, Mitchell," I said. My son kept his back to me. He was picking up the wine glasses now, carrying them to the table. "Good night, Mom. Sleep well." I went back down the stairs. The wood felt cold under my feet, even through my slippers. In my own small kitchen, I turned on the single overhead bulb. I looked inside my refrigerator. There was the carton of vegetable broth, 3 days old, and a sleeve of saltine crackers sitting on top of the microwave. I didn't feel hungry. My stomach felt like a cold stone. I went into my bedroom, turned off the lamp, and lay down on top of the hand-quilted bedspread Curtis's mother had made for our wedding. The old house was built in 1922. It had gravity-fed steam heat, which meant there were large decorative cast-iron grates set into the floors to let the heat rise from the basement to the rooms above. In my bedroom, the grate was directly beneath the ceiling, situated right under the floorboards of the upstairs kitchen sink. When the house was quiet, you could hear everything. Curtis and I used to whisper through the vents to Mitchell when he was a boy, telling him it was time to turn off his flashlight and go to sleep. Now the sound of water running in the kitchen sink came down to me, clear and sharp. Then came the clink of silverware against plates, the low, steady murmur of Mitchell's voice, and the high-pitched giggle of Leo. They were having dinner. I lay in the dark, my eyes fixed on the gray shadow of the grate on my ceiling. After about 40 minutes, I heard the scraping of chairs. Leo's footsteps faded as he went to the living room to watch his evening program. Then the sound of the dishwasher being loaded, the heavy, rhythmic thuds of the door latching. "We have to talk to her about the spring, Mitchell." Cheryl's voice came down, clear and dry, as if she were standing right in the corner of my bedroom. She was leaning against the counter near the sink. "Cheryl, not tonight," Mitchell said. His voice was muffled, heavy with the wine and the exhaustion. "I've had a killer week at the office." "We can't keep putting it off," she said. There was the sound of a glass being set down on the quartz. "The inspector said the foundation wall in the utility room is starting to bow. To fix it, they have to excavate from the inside. They'll have to tear out her kitchen down there." "We can just have them do it while she's here," Mitchell muttered. "How, Mitchell? It's going to be jackhammers and dust for 3 weeks. And honestly, she's 71. She shouldn't be breathing that in. Plus, we need to think about the space. Once the wall is fixed, that downstairs area would make the perfect office for you. You're still working from the dining room table 3 days a week." "She's lived in this house for 40 years, Cheryl," Mitchell said, his voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear it. "And she's had a wonderful run here," Cheryl replied. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was entirely logical, filled with the flat, unassailable weight of practical planning. "But she's becoming so isolated down there. I looked at that place, Shady Pines, last Tuesday. It's lovely. They have the little garden paths, and she'd be around people her own age. We could sell the cedar chest and her extra furniture to help cover the first year's deposit." There was a long silence from upstairs. I held my breath, my hands gripping the edge of the quilt so hard my knuckles clicked. "Mitchell?" Cheryl said. "I'll talk to her," my son said. The gray shadow of the ceiling grate stayed fixed above me until the light in the high basement window turned from charcoal to a thin, watery blue. I did not sleep. When you are 71, you do not sleep to escape things. You stay awake to study them. I lay there and thought of Shady Pines. I knew the place. It sat on the hill behind the strip mall off Route 28, right next to a regional car wash and an auto body shop. It had 3 floors of red brick that looked like a modern high school, with small, identical square windows that didn't open more than 3 inches for safety. Curtis and I had visited his Aunt Martha there in the 90s. I remembered the smell of the hallways, a mixture of pine bleach, boiled carrots, and the heavy, sweet scent of lavender perfume used to cover up what lay underneath. Martha had spent her days sitting in a vinyl wheelchair by the elevator, watching the numbers light up, waiting for a family that only came on Easter and the Sunday after Thanksgiving. To pay for it, Cheryl wanted to sell the cedar chest. They wanted to sell Curtis's tools. They wanted to sell the oak dining table that had held every birthday cake Mitchell had ever blown candles out on. When you give your children everything, they begin to believe everything belongs to them. They confuse your generosity with their inheritance. At 8 o'clock, I heard the painter's van pull into the gravel driveway upstairs. The side door slid open with a heavy clack shuck, and then came the thud of drop cloths and 5-gallon paint buckets hitting the kitchen floor above my head. I got out of bed, my hips aching from the dampness of the night. I went to the small steel lockbox I kept in the bottom of my closet, tucked behind my winter boots. It was a green box with a small brass key that I kept on the ring with my car key, though I hadn't driven my old Buick in nearly a year, since Mitchell had suggested we take me off the insurance to save some money. I sat on the edge of the bed and turned the key. The lock gave a dry, metallic click. Inside was my marriage certificate, my nursing school diploma from 1976, Curtis's death certificate, the paper crisp and white, and at the bottom the deed transfer document from 5 years ago. I adjusted my reading glasses and read through the 4 pages of legal prose. I had trusted the young lawyer Mitchell had hired, a boy from his Rotary Club who had smiled a lot and told me I was doing a wonderful thing for my son's future. There was no life estate clause. There was no lease agreement. There was only a single paragraph on page 3 stating that the buyers, Mitchell and Cheryl, acknowledged the seller's intent to reside in the accessory dwelling unit on a month-to-month basis, subject to mutual agreement of all parties. Month to month. I had spent 40 years building a fortress of safety for my son, and with one stroke of a pen, I had turned myself into a tenant who could be evicted with 30 days' notice if the dining room table became too crowded. I closed the box and locked it. At 3 in the afternoon, Leo came down the stairs. He didn't knock. He just pushed the door open, his small yellow backpack dragging on the floor behind him. "Grandma," he said, his face red from the school bus ride, "did you fix him?" I had set the green triceratops on the small pine table by the window. The rubber band was gone. The tail was straight, held together by a thin amber line of Curtis's old yellow wood glue. It was solid now. "I did, Leo," I said, picking up the dinosaur and handing it to him. "He's ready to go back to the swamp." Leo took the toy, his fingers running over the dried glue. "It feels bumpy." "That's the scar," I said, sitting in my chair. "Scars make things stronger. They mean you survived the break." Leo sat on the small footstool at my feet, holding the dinosaur. He looked around my room, his eyes lingering on the neat stacks of books on my shelves, the old quilts, the silver frame of his grandmother on the dresser. "Why is it so quiet down here?" he asked. "Because upstairs is loud today, Sweet Pea. The painters are making a lot of noise." "I don't like the new white walls," Leo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They look like the doctor's office, and Mommy said we can't touch them with our hands anymore." "Your Mommy wants to keep them clean." "But when they were yellow, I could measure how tall I was on the kitchen door," he said. "The pencil lines are gone now. Mommy painted over them." I felt a cold prickle of pain behind my eyes. I had forgotten about the height marks on the pantry door frame. Mitchell's marks started in 1991, a tiny pencil line near the floor that said 3 years. Curtis's neat, square handwriting had recorded every inch of Mitchell's growth until he reached 6 feet at 17. And then we had started Leo's marks on the other side. They had painted over that, too. "We'll remember how tall you are, Leo," I said, leaning forward to brush a stray lock of brown hair from his forehead. "We don't need the wall to tell us." He looked at me, his gray eyes steady and serious. "Are you going to go away, Grandma?" The question hung in the cool air of the basement, heavy and sharp. "Why would you ask that, Leo?" "Mommy was looking at pictures of a big house on her computer," he said. "She said you were going to go live in a place with a lot of other grandmas, and that I could have your room for my trains." I took a breath. It smelled of cedar and the damp stone of the foundation. "Your mommy is just thinking about the future, Leo," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm right here, right now. Go on up and get your snack. The school bus always makes you hungry." He hesitated, then stood up, clutching the dinosaur. He didn't run up the stairs this time. He walked, his small shoes hitting each step with a slow, heavy thud. At 7:30 that evening, Mitchell came down. He didn't have his briefcase. He was wearing his soft flannel shirt, the blue one I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago, and he was carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He'd put honey in them. I could smell the sweet, warm steam from the doorway. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping into my sitting room. He looked around, his eyes avoiding my dresser, avoiding the silver frame of his grandmother. He sat in Curtis's old wingback chair, his knees high, his large frame looking awkward and out of place in the small room. He handed me one of the mugs. "I thought you might want some tea. It's chilly down here tonight." "Thank you, Mitchell," I said, holding the warm ceramic between my palms. He took a slow sip of his tea. His face was pale, the skin under his eyes dark and shadowed. He looked at the floor between his feet, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Mom," he began, his voice low and tight. "Cheryl and I were talking today." He stopped. The house upstairs was completely silent now. Leo was in bed, and Cheryl was likely in the kitchen, waiting for the sound of the door at the top of the stairs to open. "We're really worried about your health down here," Mitchell said. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on his shoes. "The damp. The doctor said your arthritis is only going to get worse in the winter. And with the foundation wall bowing in the utility room, it's going to be a lot of construction. Noise, dust, mold. It's not safe for you." I sat very still, watching my son struggle with the script his wife had written for him. "We want you to be comfortable, Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We want you to have a place where you can have people around, where you don't have to worry about the stairs." He finally looked up, his gray eyes searching my face, pleading with me to make this easy for him. He wanted me to smile, to nod, to tell him that Shady Pines was exactly what I wanted. He wanted me to save him from his own guilt. I set my tea mug down on the table, right next to Curtis's old Dutch master's cigar box. "Mitchell," I said quietly, "did you know your father worked 44 hours of overtime in November of 1989 so you could have that blue wool coat from Sears?" Mitchell stared at me, his mug of chamomile tea frozen halfway to his mouth. The steam rose between us, a thin, wavering curtain that smelled of sweet honey and old dust. His jaw tightened. He looked down at the Dutch master's box on the table, then quickly away, as if the faded cardboard were hot to the touch. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was too low, too deliberate. "That was 1989. What does a winter coat have to do with the foundation wall?" "Everything, Mitchell," I said. My hands were steady on my lap. "Your father didn't just buy you a coat. He bought you a childhood where you never had to feel the cold. We kept this house drafty. We kept the thermostat at 62, and we ate cabbage and potatoes 3 nights a week so you could have college tuition and a car that started in the winter. We did that because we thought we were building a foundation for you. And we appreciate that, Mom," he said, the word appreciate sounding like something he'd practiced in a mirror. "But times change. The house is old. It needs work we can't afford if we're only using half the space. We're just trying to look out for you." Are you looking out for me, Mitchell? Or are you looking out for your home office? The question was very quiet, but it hit the room like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. Mitchell's face went dark red, the color rushing up from his collar. He set his mug down on the side table with a sharp clink that splashed a few amber drops of tea onto the wood. He stood up, his height making the low basement ceiling feel even lower, more suffocating. "You were listening through the register," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice held a mixture of anger and a deep, defensive shame. "I didn't have to try to listen, Mitchell," I said, looking up at him. "The greats in this house have carried our voices for 40 years. I heard your wife discuss selling my grandmother's cedar chest to pay the deposit for a room behind a car wash." "It's not behind a car wash," Mitchell snapped, his voice cracking. He took a step toward the window, then turned back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "It's Shady Pines, Mom. It's a Gold Star facility. Cheryl spent 3 weeks on the waiting list just to get us a tour. They have a physical therapy wing, a dining room with a chef, and a view of the car wash," I finished for him. "You're being unfair," he muttered, looking at the ceiling. "You're making me out to be the bad guy here. We paid off $30,000 of your debt when we bought this place. We saved you from foreclosure. You bought a house worth $400,000 for the $92,000 left on the mortgage, Mitchell, I said. My voice didn't rise. I didn't want to scream. Screaming gives people permission to call you hysterical, to say you aren't thinking clearly. You didn't save me. I gave you your inheritance early, so your family could have a yard for Leo. He flinched. For a second, the heavy, defensive mask of the 40-year-old manager slipped, and I saw the boy who had dropped his grandfather's pocket watch down the well and lied about it for 3 days. Before he could speak, the door at the top of the stairs clicked open. The footsteps that followed were light, quick, and precise. Cheryl didn't descend the stairs like someone entering a basement. She came down like a building inspector. She was wearing a gray cashmere sweater that looked very soft and very expensive, and she carried a neat navy blue pocket folder under her arm. "Mitchell?" she said as she reached the bottom step. She looked at his red face, then at my cold mug of tea, and finally at me. Her expression didn't change. Her smile was small, polite, and entirely clinical. "The painter wanted to know about the trim in the hallway, but I see you're already in the middle of it." She stepped into my sitting room, her presence immediately making the space feel crowded, as if she were taking up all the oxygen. She sat on the edge of the other wingback chair, the one Curtis had always sat in when he was checking the household ledgers. She placed the blue folder on her lap and smoothed it with her hand. "Lorraine," she said, her voice carrying that perfect therapeutic calm, "I'm glad we're all here to talk about this. I know it's hard. Change is always difficult, especially at your age. But we have to look at the reality of the situation." "The reality, Cheryl?" I asked. "Yes," she said, opening the folder. Inside were several glossy brochures with photos of smiling elderly couples walking through manicured gardens. The structural engineer was very clear. The bowing in the south foundation wall is serious. To fix it, they have to bring in heavy equipment. The noise, the dust, the chemicals, it's going to make this lower level completely uninhabitable for at least 3 to 4 months. We can't let you live down here during that. It would be a massive liability for us. And honestly, it's not safe for your lungs." She paused, waiting for me to argue. I didn't. I just watched her. "So we have 2 options," Cheryl continued, her fingernails, neatly manicured with a pale pink polish, tapping the edge of the folder. "We can either rent you a small apartment nearby for the winter, which would be very expensive and very isolating for you, or we can use this opportunity to make a permanent transition to a community where you'll have support. Shady Pines has an opening in March. If we secure it now with a deposit, we can transition you gently, without the rush." "And the deposit?" I asked. "My Social Security doesn't cover a deposit for a place like that." "We've looked into that," Cheryl said. She didn't look at Mitchell, who was still standing by the window, his back to both of us. "If we liquidate the excess furniture down here, the dining table upstairs, the cedar chest, your husband's old tools in the shed, we can easily cover the first 3 months. After that, we'll help you subsidize the cost from our own accounts. We're willing to make that sacrifice for your safety, Lorraine." Our own accounts. She spoke of their money as if it had dropped from the sky, forgetting that the very roof over their heads had been handed to them for a quarter of its value. A child's memory is a selective thing. They remember the rules you made them follow, but they forget the nights you spent sitting in the dark, figuring out how to afford the ceiling over their heads. "I see," I said. I looked at Mitchell. "Is this what you want, Mitchell?" My son didn't turn around. He kept his hands in his pockets, his forehead pressed against the cold glass of the small basement window. "Mom," he muttered, his voice muffled by the glass, it's the logical thing to do. We can't keep living like this. We're on top of each other. Cheryl needs her space, and I need an office." "He's right, Lorraine," Cheryl said, her voice rising slightly, the first hint of hardness showing through her polite exterior. "We've been very patient. We've kept our boundaries soft for 5 years. But we have a family to run. We have Leo to think about. We need to start going through your things next weekend to see what we can sell and what we can donate. The estate liquidator needs a list by the 15th. She closed the blue folder with a sharp slap. "We've scheduled the appraiser for Saturday morning at 9, she said. "We'd appreciate it if you had the boxes sorted by then." They left the blue folder on the small pine table by my tea. I didn't open it. I didn't need to look at the glossy photographs of 80-year-olds playing bocce ball on artificial turf to know what my life would look like in a room that smelled of industrial carpet and lavender spray. Instead, I sat in the dark and listened to them walk upstairs. Their footsteps were lighter now, faster, carrying the easy, unburdened rhythm of 2 people who had just crossed a difficult item off their weekend to-do list. The door at the top of the stairs clicked shut, and then there was only the hum of the old refrigerator in my small kitchen, and the distant, dry rattle of the oak leaves against the cellar window. The cruelest families are often the most polite in public. They won't raise their voices to hurt you. They'll just use a spreadsheet and a soft, therapeutic tone of voice to tell you that you no longer fit inside their lives. On Wednesday morning, the house was quiet. Mitchell had left for his office in the city at 6, and Cheryl had taken Leo to his speech therapy session across town. I went up to the main kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. The painters had finished the hallway. The walls were now a cold, sterile white that made the dark oak trim look old and dirty, like a pair of muddy boots sitting on a clean sheet. On the kitchen island, next to Cheryl's closed laptop, sat a small plastic sheet of colored adhesive dots. They were the kind you buy at an office supply store for garage sales. There were 3 sheets, green, blue, and red. Next to the sheets was a yellow legal pad with Cheryl's neat, rounded handwriting at the top. Inventory prep, November 11th. I looked down the list. Cherry sideboard, dining room, blue. Oak dining table, blue. Grandfather clock, hallway, blue. Cedar chest, garage, blue. Curtis's tool chest, shed, blue. Pine bookcase, basement, blue. I walked into the dining room. There, on the corner of the cherry sideboard Curtis had spent 3 months building for our 10th anniversary, was a single, small, blue dot. It looked like a tiny neon bruise on the dark wood. I went to the hallway. The grandfather clock, the one my father had given us when Mitchell was born, the one that had kept the steady, heavy heartbeat of this house for 38 years, had a blue dot stuck to the brass glass case key. They weren't just clearing out the basement. They were stripping the house of its bones. To Cheryl, these weren't pieces of a life. They were assets. They were the currency she would use to buy back the space she felt I had stolen from her by continuing to exist in the basement. I felt a quiet, cold anger begin to settle deep in my chest. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes your hands shake or your voice rise. It was the slow, steady heat of a furnace that has been burning coal for 40 years. I walked past the dining room toward the small alcove under the stairs where the wireless printer sat. Curtis had set up a small desk there in the 90s, and Cheryl now used it as her home administration station. The printer's green status light was blinking in the dim light of the alcove. Resting in the paper output tray was a single sheet of paper, still warm from the ink. I picked it up. It was an email confirmation from an online estate liquidation service called Pittsburgh Legacy Appraisals. Dear Cheryl, the email read, thank you for confirming the dates for the estate sale at 1412 Maple Lane. As discussed, our team will arrive on Thursday, November 16th, to begin cataloging and staging the items. The public sale will be held on Saturday, November 18th, and Sunday, November 19th. Please ensure the lower-level tenant has cleared all personal items from the designated staging areas by Wednesday evening. The paper felt hot in my hands. November 18th. That was next weekend. They had told me March. They had sat in my room, drank my tea, and looked me in the eye while lying about the timeline. They had given me 4 months in their words, but in their plans they had given me 9 days. They wanted the appraiser to come while I was still down here, to catalog the bed I slept in and the chair I sat in while I was still using them. They wanted to strip the walls around me so that by the time the contractors arrived in the spring, I would already be living in an empty shell with nowhere left to sit but the floor. I folded the paper carefully, smoothing the crease with my thumb, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. I looked at the small sheet of colored dots on the kitchen island. I picked up the blue sheet. I peeled off one of the small neon stickers and held it between my thumb and forefinger. I walked into the living room and stood in front of the large framed portrait of Mitchell that hung over the fireplace. It was his official corporate headshot, the one where he was wearing a dark blue suit, smiling a professional, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a man who knew how to manage resources, how to streamline systems, how to cut costs. I reached out and pressed the blue dot directly onto the glass, right over his left eye. Then I went back down to the basement. I sat at my small kitchen table and pulled out the green lockbox from beneath my bed. I unlocked it, took out the deed transfer document, and sat there with a magnifying glass, reading every single line of the small print on page 3. I was looking for the definition of tenant. I was looking for the word eviction. And then I saw it. On the very last page, under the section marked Covenants and Restrictions, there was a clause that the young lawyer from Mitchell's Rotary Club had likely copied from a standard template without reading it. The parties agree that during the lifetime of the seller, Lorraine Miller, any material alteration to the structural integrity of the lower-level dwelling unit or any change in the occupancy thereof shall require 90 days written notice delivered via certified mail and shall be subject to the mediation procedures of the Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. 90 days, and it had to be delivered via certified mail. I looked at my desk, There was no certified mail envelope. There was no green slip from the post office. There was only Cheryl's blue folder and her polite oral lies. I reached for my telephone. I didn't call Mitchell. I didn't call Cheryl. I called a number I had kept in the back of my address book for 12 years. The number of Raymond Vance, an old friend of Curtis's who had spent 40 years practicing real estate law in the city before retiring to a small farm 3 miles down the road. "Raymond?" I said when the phone stopped ringing. My voice was very calm, very quiet. "It's Lorraine. I need you to come over for a cup of tea. Bring your spectacles." Raymond Vance arrived at 2 in the afternoon, carrying a worn brown leather briefcase that looked older than my marriage. He was 74 now, his hair a thin halo of white, but his eyes were still the same sharp, slate gray they had been when he and Curtis used to fish for trout in the Laurel Highlands. He walked with a slight limp, his boots making a heavy, slow thud-clack on my linoleum floor. He didn't ask for a tour of my small apartment. He simply sat at my laminate kitchen table, laid his briefcase flat, and clicked the brass latches open with a sound that felt remarkably like a pistol cocking. "I brought the original file, Lorraine," Raymond said, his voice dry and slow, like paper rubbing together. He took out a thick manila folder tied with a faded red string. "I was the notary on the deed transfer 5 years ago, remember? I kept my copy of the covenants. I told Curtis before he passed that I'd keep an eye on things for you." "Thank you, Raymond," I said, setting a mug of peppermint tea in front of him. I didn't know who else to call. The lawyer Mitchell used. He's very polite, but he's one of Cheryl's friends from the country club. Raymond adjusted his thick bifocals and spread the deed transfer document across the table. His liver-spotted hand, rough from years of farm work, smoothed the paper flat. He spent 10 minutes reading in silence, his index finger tracing each line of print, his lips moving soundlessly as he processed the legal jargon. "Well," he said finally, taking a slow sip of his tea, "they can't do it." "They can't?" "Not next weekend. Not in March either, if you don't want them to," Raymond said. He tapped a section on the 4th page, the one I had highlighted in yellow. "This covenant is ironclad. It's a standard life tenancy protection clause. If they want to do any construction that impacts your access to this lower level, or if they want to terminate your occupancy, they must give you 90 days written notice, and it has to be delivered via certified mail." He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. "Have you signed for any green cards from the post office lately, Lorraine?" "No," I said, "nothing." "Then they haven't started the clock," Raymond said. "And more importantly, they cannot touch your personal property. The furniture in this basement, Curtis's tools in the shed, those are yours. They were not part of the deed transfer. If they put your things in an estate sale without your written consent, that's civil theft, plain and simple. I don't care what kind of contract your daughter-in-law signed with an appraiser." He leaned back in the chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. His face looked grave, the deep lines around his mouth sagging. "But you need to understand something, Lorraine," he said quietly. "The law is a blunt instrument. It can keep them from moving your bed, but it can't make them sit with you at Sunday dinner. If you use this, the house is going to get very cold." "The house is already cold, Raymond," I said. "The only difference is that right now they're the ones controlling the thermostat." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet, understanding sorrow. He knew what it was like to watch the world you built slowly slip away. Then we let them know we're standing on the line. I'll draft a formal letter of non-consent regarding the estate sale and the construction. I'll have it delivered to Mitchell's office tomorrow morning by courier. He'll have to sign for it in front of his secretary. No, I said, my voice surprising both of us with its firmness. Not Mitchell's office. I want Cheryl to receive it. Here. Raymond looked at me for a long moment, then a very small, dry smile touched his lips. You always were the quiet one, Lorraine, but you've got Curtis's iron. The hardest battle you will ever fight is the one where victory means realizing your own child is your opponent. You don't want to hurt them, but you finally understand that if you don't stand your ground, they will walk right over you and never look back to see where you fell. Raymond left at 4. At 5:30, the SUV pulled into the driveway. I heard the garage door roll up, the heavy rumble vibrating through my ceiling. Then came the sound of the back door opening, the high, sweet voice of Leo talking about his speech group, and the quick, sharp tap of Cheryl's heels in the kitchen. 10 minutes later, the door at the top of the basement stairs opened. The footsteps that came down were not Mitchell's. They were too light, too fast. Cheryl came down the stairs, but she didn't have her navy blue folder this time. In her hand, held between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were a piece of medical waste, was the small blue adhesive dot I had placed on Mitchell's portrait. She stepped into my sitting room. The polite, clinical mask she had worn for 5 years was still there, but the edges were frayed. Her eyes were very bright, her mouth set in a thin, hard line. "Lorraine," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper that felt sharper than a shout. "Did you put this on Mitchell's picture?" I was sitting in my armchair, the Dutch master's cigar box resting in my lap. I didn't stand up. I didn't look flustered. "I did, Cheryl," I said. "Why would you do that?" she asked, taking a step closer. It was incredibly childish. Mitchell was very hurt when he came home and saw it. We're trying to manage a very stressful transition for this family, and we don't need passive-aggressive behavior. "I was just following your instructions, Cheryl," I said, my voice level and quiet. "You said on Saturday that everything of value in this house was to be marked for inventory. I wanted to make sure we didn't forget Mitchell." Cheryl's pink-nailed hand shook slightly as she crumpled the small blue sticker into a tiny ball. "This is our house, Lorraine. We own the deed. We have been incredibly generous letting you stay down here for 5 years, but we have a right to utilize our property. The estate liquidators are coming on Thursday. You need to have your personal belongings sorted by Wednesday night." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the copy of the deed transfer page I had highlighted. I laid it on the table between us. "The estate liquidators can come, Cheryl," I said, "but they won't be entering the basement, and they won't be touching Curtis's tools or my mother's sideboard." Cheryl looked at the paper on the table, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" "That is page 3 of the deed transfer," I said. "The page with the covenant. Raymond Vance was here this afternoon. He's Curtis's old lawyer. He's drafting a formal notice of non-consent. If any appraiser or mover attempts to touch my property, or if any contractor attempts to begin work down here without the 90 days written certified notice, Raymond will file an immediate injunction with the Allegheny County Court." I looked directly into her eyes, the eyes that had spent 5 years looking past me, looking at the walls, looking at the future she wanted to build on top of my silence. "You have 9 days until your sale, Cheryl," I said quietly. "If you try to clear this basement, you'll be doing it in front of a sheriff's deputy." Cheryl didn't look at the paper on the table for more than 3 seconds, but I saw her eyes skip over the yellow highlighted lines. Her pink-polished fingernails curved into her palms, the knuckles turning white. She didn't scream. That would have violated her rules of conduct, the modern, self-controlled persona she wore like armor. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath that whistled slightly through her teeth. "You're being incredibly short-sighted, Lorraine," she said, her voice thin and cold, like winter wind through a keyhole. "We were going to use the proceeds from the estate sale to pay for Leo's tuition at the academy. You're hurting your own grandson because of some stubborn pride over old wood and rusted tools." "Leo doesn't need private school to learn how to treat his family, Cheryl," I said. "And Curtis's tools aren't rusted. He oiled them every autumn. You'd know that if you'd ever opened the chest, instead of just looking at it to see how much it would fetch on the internet." Cheryl stood there for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the highlighted deed copy. She looked as if she wanted to tear the paper in half, but she knew that wouldn't erase the ink on the county record. Without another word, she turned and walked up the stairs, her heels hitting the wood with a sharp, hollow tack, tack, tack that faded into the kitchen above. The most dangerous thing about a quiet woman is that you never know how long she's been gathering the dry wood before she decides to light the match. That night, the house was silent for a long time. No music played upstairs. Leo's television program was turned off early. Around 10 o'clock, the murmur began through the heating register in my bedroom ceiling. It wasn't a shouting match. Mitchell and Cheryl were not a couple who yelled. They were people who weaponized their whispers. "How did we miss this, Cheryl?" Mitchell's voice came down, tight and raspy, with a sharp, nervous edge. "You told me your lawyer went over the deed with a fine-tooth comb before we signed." "He did," Cheryl hissed back, her voice carrying a low, venomous hum. "It's a standard life tenancy clause, Mitchell. Most old people don't have the money or the energy to hire a retired real estate lawyer to enforce it. How was I supposed to know she'd call Raymond Vance? He's practically 90. "He's 74, and his office is 3 miles away," Mitchell said, his boots pacing the floorboards directly above my head. Squeak, squeak, squeak. "The appraiser said if we cancel the cataloging for the high-ticket items, the sideboard, the tools, the grandfather clock, we still owe them 40% of the estimated commission as a cancellation fee. That's nearly $2,000, Cheryl. We don't have it." "Then we have to get her to sign a waiver," Cheryl said. "We have to make her see that this is for the best. Talk to her, Mitchell. She's your mother. She's always done whatever you wanted." "She's not listening to me anymore," Mitchell muttered. I heard the sound of a chair scraping back, then the heavy clink of a glass being set on the quartz island. "She looked at me tonight like she didn't even know who I was." "Well, you'd better find a way to make her remember," Cheryl said, her voice dropping into a flat, hard tone that had no pretense of warmth left. Because if we don't hold that sale next weekend, the bank is going to notice the escrow account is empty, and then we lose more than just the basement. I lay in the dark, my heart ticking in my chest like the grandfather clock in the hall. The escrow account, the bank, they weren't just trying to get me out because Cheryl wanted a mudroom or because Mitchell needed a home office. They were in trouble. On Friday morning, Raymond Vance's formal letter of non-consent was delivered. I was sitting by my window, watching the gray Pittsburgh fog cling to the bare branches of the maples when the courier's red car pulled into the driveway. A young man in a yellow vest walked up the porch steps, carrying a stiff cardboard envelope. 5 minutes later, the door at the top of my stairs opened. Mitchell came down. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his blue tie was loosened, hanging crookedly around his collar. His hair was messy, as if he'd spent the last 3 hours running his fingers through it. He held the white courier envelope in his left hand, the paper crumpled where his thumb had gripped it. He stepped into my sitting room and stopped. He looked smaller today, his shoulders hunched, his eyes bloodshot and watery. He looked like the boy who used to sit on the radiator in the hallway, waiting for his father to come home and tell him how to fix what he'd broken. "Mom," he said. His voice was cracked, dry, and thick. "How could you do this to me? To your own son?" "I didn't do anything to you, Mitchell," I said, my voice quiet in the small room. "I simply asked you to respect my home, the home your father and I gave you." "Your home?" Mitchell said, a sudden desperate anger flaring in his eyes, though it looked thin like paper smoke. "We bought this house. We paid your debts. I'm the one on the deed, Mom." "You paid $92,000 for a $400,000 property, Mitchell," I said. "And you did it with the understanding that I would live out my days in this basement. Now you're trying to sell my mother's sideboard and my husband's tools to pay a deposit on a room behind a car wash. Why?" Mitchell stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at the Dutch master's cigar box on my table, then at his grandmother's silver-plated frame on my dresser. Slowly the anger drained out of his face, leaving only a hollow, gray exhaustion. He sat down in the wingback chair, his hands dropping between his knees. He looked at the floor, his shoulders shaking just a fraction. "We don't have the money, Mom," he whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, cold, and absolute. "What do you mean, Mitchell?" I asked. "I was laid off 3 months ago," he said, still looking at his shoes. "The logistics firm, they restructured. They cut 60% of the senior managers. I've been pretending to go to work 3 days a week. I sit in the parking lot of the public library in McCandless and send out resumes on my laptop." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his skin looking gray in the dim light of the basement. "Cheryl's credit card debt. It's $80,000, Mom. She didn't tell me until the bank threatened to freeze our accounts last month. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank, they sent a pre-foreclosure notice last week. If we don't get $20,000 by the end of the month to bring the loan current, they're going to file." He looked up at me, his eyes wide, wet, and filled with a terrifying, childlike panic. "If we don't sell the furniture next weekend, Mom," he said, his voice trembling, "we're going to lose the house. All of us." I looked at my son, really looked at him. He was 38 years old, with gray hair beginning to silver the temples, wearing a $70 shirt, weeping in a basement armchair that had belonged to his father. All of it, the organic meal services, the cashmere sweaters, the gray linen runners, the muted linen paint on the walls. It was all just paper-thin wood holding up a house with no foundation. Cheryl's boundaries, her clean minimalist spaces, her clinical rules of conduct, they weren't signs of modern success. They were the desperate, high-control maneuvers of a woman who was drowning and trying to make sure no one on the shore saw the water in her mouth. They were going to sacrifice me to buy themselves 3 more months of pretending to be wealthy. They were going to sell the cedar chest and my grandmother's portrait to pay for a country club lifestyle that was already dead. People who live to impress their neighbors will gladly burn their own mother's house down just to keep the front porch light on. "How much is the mortgage payment, Mitchell?" I asked. My voice was very low, very quiet. $4,000 a month, he muttered, his face still buried in his hands. With the late fees and the legal escrow costs, it's $19,800 to bring it current. The bank, they gave us until November 27th. If the money isn't in their office by 4 o'clock that day, they file the foreclosure at the courthouse. It goes in the local paper, Mom. Everyone will see it. Everyone will see it. Even now, with his life collapsing around him, his greatest fear was the print in the local newspaper. He was his father's son in his height and his voice, but he had none of Curtis's marrow. Curtis wouldn't have cared if the county paper printed his name in red ink, as long as his family was warm and fed. "And you were going to sell my furniture to pay this month's bill?" I asked. "And what about next month, Mitchell? What were you going to sell in December? The refrigerator? Leo's toys?" Cheryl thought that if we got the Shady Pines deposit down, we could rent this basement unit out for $2,200 a month, Mitchell whispered, his voice trembling. "There's a graduate student at the university who wanted it. We thought that, plus the estate sale money, would give us 6 months to find me a new job." "And where was I supposed to go while you were waiting for this graduate student to pay your mortgage?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was too heavy for him to lift. They hadn't thought about where I would go. They had simply wanted me gone, tucked away behind the car wash, out of sight and out of mind, so they could use my floorboards to stay afloat. I stood up from my chair and walked over to my desk. In the back of the bottom drawer, beneath my old tax returns and the manual for my sewing machine, was a small blue vinyl passbook from the St. Patrick's Credit Union. Curtis had opened that account in 1974. Every month for 45 years, he had walked into the branch office on Main Street and deposited $25, sometimes $50 if the mill had given him an extra shift. When he passed away, the account had $42,000 in it. Before he died, when his breath was just a thin rattle in his chest, he had taken my hand and whispered, "Lorraine, don't tell the boy about the credit union. A man in debt is a man who will compromise his own blood. Keep a back pocket. You'll need it when the winter comes." I had kept that book hidden for 5 years. I hadn't touched a single penny of it, not even when my knees began to ache and I needed the injections that the library insurance didn't cover. I had saved it because I knew, with the deep, quiet instinct of a mother, that Mitchell was a man who built his life on sand. I held the blue passbook in my hand. It was $38,400 now, after some small interest. It was enough to cure their default. It was enough to buy them 5 months of breathing room. But I wasn't going to hand it to him. If I gave it to Mitchell, he would hand it to Cheryl, and by Christmas it would be gone, dissolved into credit card payments and high-end grocery bills, and we would be standing in the same cold room in the spring. "Mitchell," I said, "look at me." He raised his head, his eyes red and swollen, his face looking old and beaten in the gray basement light. "I have the money," I said. He gasped, his body jerking forward in the chair. You do? Dad's life insurance? I thought that was gone." "It doesn't matter where it is," I said. "What matters is what we are going to do with it." Before he could answer, the door at the top of the stairs opened. The sound of Cheryl's heels on the wood was different this time. It wasn't the light, sharp tap of the manager. It was a slow, heavy, hesitant sound. She came down the stairs one step at a time, her hand gripping the banister. Her cashmere sweater looked slightly rumpled, and she had taken off her makeup, leaving her face looking pale, sharp, and narrow. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at Mitchell, saw his tears, and then looked at me. Her eyes darted to the blue passbook in my hand. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a general who had sent her last regiment into the field and was waiting to see if they had been slaughtered. "Did he tell you?" she asked. Her voice didn't have the therapeutic warmth anymore. It was flat, dry, and cold. "He did," I said, setting the blue passbook flat on the table. Cheryl stepped into the room. She stood next to Mitchell's chair, her hand resting on his shoulder. But it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was the gesture of an owner placing her hand on a piece of property she was about to lose. "Then you know we don't have a choice, Lorraine," she said, her voice rising just a fraction, trying to find its old authoritative rhythm. "If we don't hold the sale next weekend, the bank—" "There will be no estate sale, Cheryl," I said, my voice cutting through her words like a quiet pair of shears through silk. "And there will be no graduate student in this basement." Cheryl's eyes narrowed. "Then how are we going to pay the $19,000, Lorraine? Do you want us to lose the house? Do you want Leo on the street?" "I am going to pay the $19,000, I said. Cheryl froze. I watched the realization hit her, the sudden, sharp calculation running behind her gray eyes. She looked at the blue book, then at Mitchell, then back at me. A small, desperate hope flared in her face, followed immediately by a deep, defensive caution. "But I'm not giving it to you," I said. I picked up the copy of the deed transfer document from the table and held it out to her. "If I pay the bank," I said, "we are going to sign a new agreement, a legal agreement, drawn up by Raymond Vance." Cheryl swallowed hard, her pink lips parting. "What kind of agreement?" "One that gives me 60% ownership of this property," I said, "and one that puts my name back on the deed as the primary trustee. If you want my money, Cheryl, you're going to give me back my house." Cheryl's mouth opened, but for a long 5 seconds, no sound came out. She looked at Mitchell, her eyes pleading with him to find some loophole, some masculine authority, some legal trick to save them from this surrender. But Mitchell just sat there, his head down, his fingers tracing a tear in the fabric of the wingback chair. He had no fight left in him. He had spent 3 months sitting in a library parking lot, watching his life dissolve onto a computer screen. He was a man who had already accepted his own defeat. He was just waiting for someone else to sign the terms. 60%? Cheryl whispered, her voice cracking slightly, the clinical polish completely gone now. Lorraine, that's control. We won't be able to make a single decision about this property without your written consent. We won't be able to refinance. We won't be able to sell if Mitchell gets a job in another city. Exactly, I said. You won't be able to sell Curtis's wood to pay for your cashmere. You won't be able to paint over any more door frames without my permission. If I am going to buy your safety, Cheryl, I am going to make sure you can't use it to drown me. It's not fair, she muttered, her eyes turning red at the rims. We've put $30,000 of our own money into this place. The slate roof. The slate roof was 50 years old, Cheryl, I said, my voice steady and cold. You didn't replace it to be kind. You replaced it because the bank wouldn't insure the loan if you didn't. You bought this house for a quarter of its value, and you treated me like an old winter coat you could tuck into the cedar chest when you were finished with it. Now you're cold, and you want my wool. But if you take it, you're going to live by my rules. Mitchell, say something, Cheryl snapped, her hand digging into his shoulder so hard her pink nails turned white. Tell her we can find another way. What about your uncle? What about a personal loan? Mitchell didn't look up. My uncle has been dead for 2 years, Cheryl, he said, his voice flat and hollow. And no one is going to give a personal loan to a logistics manager who hasn't had an office since August. We don't have $20,000. If we don't sign, the sheriff's notice goes on the front door in 16 days. He finally raised his head and looked at his wife. The look in his eyes was bitter, old, and tired. We sign, Cheryl, or we start packing. The quietest people are often the ones who know exactly how much your pride is worth, and exactly when you can no longer afford to pay for it. On Saturday morning, Raymond Vance came back to the house. We sat in the dining room, the room Cheryl had painted muted linen. The morning light came through the leaded glass windows, cold and gray, casting long, sharp shadows across the oak floor. Raymond laid 3 copies of the new deed trust agreement flat on the cherry sideboard, the one with the small blue dot still stuck to the corner of the wood. Mitchell sat on one side of the table, his hands flat on his knees. Cheryl sat next to him, her posture stiff and rigid as a board. She had put on her makeup today, her face looking like a mask of pale plaster, her lips painted a dark, hard red. Raymond adjusted his glasses and clicked his pen. I've prepared the deed modification, Raymond said, his dry, paper-like voice filling the quiet room. It transfers 60% of the beneficial interest in the property at 1412 Maple Lane back to Lorraine Miller as primary trustee. Mitchell and Cheryl will retain 40% as secondary beneficiaries. The agreement also stipulates that Lorraine has a lifetime, non-revocable lease on the entire lower level, free of any rent or utility obligations. He looked at Cheryl over the rim of his glasses. And the estate sale next weekend is officially canceled. I've already sent a formal notice to Pittsburgh Legacy Appraisals. They weren't happy, but they've agreed to waive the 40% commission fee in exchange for a flat $500 cancellation fee, which Lorraine has already agreed to pay from her personal funds. Cheryl looked at the pen in Raymond's hand as if it were a small black snake. "Lorraine," she said, her voice dry, "before I sign this, I want you to know something. We did this for Leo. We wanted him to have a good school. We wanted him to have a life where he didn't have to worry about—" She stopped. She couldn't say the word money. To her, admitting a financial limit was like admitting a moral failing. "I know why you did it, Cheryl," I said quietly. "But you forgot that the most important thing you can give a child is a family that doesn't eat its own to survive." Raymond slid the document across the table. "Sign here, Mitchell. And here, Cheryl." Mitchell reached out, took the pen, and signed his name. His signature was quick, messy, and crooked, the hand of a man who just wanted to get out of the room. He handed the pen to Cheryl. She held it for a long moment, her hand shaking just a fraction. Then, with a slow, heavy breath, she pressed the tip to the paper and wrote her name. "There," Raymond said, taking the papers back and sliding them into his leather briefcase. He took out a cashier's check, one I had drawn from the St. Patrick's Credit Union yesterday afternoon, and set it on the table. It was made out to the primary mortgage lender for $19,800. "That will cure the default," Raymond said. "Mitchell, you need to overnight this to the bank's legal counsel in Harrisburg on Monday morning. Make sure you get a tracking number." "I will," Mitchell muttered. Raymond stood up, his joints making a dry, cracking sound. He looked at me, his gray eyes soft with a quiet, paternal concern. "I'll file these with the county recorder's office first thing Monday, Lorraine. You're the owner of record again." "Thank you, Raymond," I said. I walked him to the front door. The hallway smelled of fresh paint and wood wax. As Raymond reached the porch steps, he paused. He looked back at me, his brow furrowing, his mouth twisting as if he were trying to decide whether to say something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded, yellow slip of paper. "Lorraine," he whispered, looking past my shoulder to make sure Mitchell and Cheryl were still in the dining room. "When I ran the title search at the courthouse yesterday to prepare the deed, I found something else." My heart gave a small, cold thump. "What is it, Raymond?" "They didn't just fall behind on the primary mortgage," Raymond said, his voice barely louder than the wind in the maples. "They took out a second line of credit last November, a home equity line for $82,000, and the lender is a private equity firm out of Delaware." He handed me the yellow slip. It was a copy of the county lien registry. "Lorraine," Raymond said, his eyes dark with a grave, heavy warning. "The second lender has already filed a notice of default. They aren't looking to foreclose. They're looking to sell the debt to a collection agency. Your $20,000 cured the first mortgage, but it didn't touch this. They've borrowed against Curtis's wood, Lorraine, and the wolf is already at the side door." I stood on the front porch for a long time after Raymond's car disappeared around the bend of Maple Lane. The November wind was rising, shaking the last dry brown leaves from the maples. It was a cold, clean wind, but it carried the smell of coal smoke from the valley and the sharp, damp scent of the river. I looked down at the yellow slip of paper in my hand. Apex Recovery and Acquisitions, LLC, Delaware. Principal balance, $82,410.12. Notice of default and intent to accelerate, October 24th. The paper felt cold against my skin, like a piece of dry ice. They had lied to me. Even when Mitchell was weeping in my armchair, even when he was laying bare his shame, his layoff, and Cheryl's credit card debt, he had still kept the largest rot hidden behind his back. He had given me just enough of the truth to get his hands on my $38,000, keeping the rest of the disaster buried in the yard. The most dangerous liar is not the one who denies the truth, but the one who only gives you enough of it to save themselves, leaving you to drown in the rest when the tide comes back in. I walked back inside. The front door closed with a heavy, solid click that felt different now. This house was 60% mine again, but it felt like a ship that had been salvaged, only to realize its hull was already filled with concrete. Mitchell and Cheryl were still in the dining room. The cashier's check for $19,800 was sitting on the center of the oak table. Mitchell was staring at it, his shoulders slightly less hunched than they had been an hour ago. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash, checking his limbs to see if they still worked. Cheryl was standing by the window, her back to him, her fingers tracing the edge of the muted linen trim. Her posture had already begun to stiffen again, the fragile, elegant armor of her pride rebuilding itself, piece by piece, now that the immediate threat of the sheriff's notice had been averted. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a faint, familiar touch of its old, clinical rhythm. "We need to get that check to the post office. Mitchell, make sure you use the registered mail. We can't afford any administrative delays with the lender." "I will," Mitchell said, reaching out to take the check. I walked into the dining room. My slippers made no sound on the old oak floor. I didn't stop until I was standing right at the edge of the table, directly opposite my son. I reached out and laid the yellow courthouse slip flat on top of the cashier's check. Mitchell's hand froze an inch from the paper. He looked at the yellow slip, his brow furrowing, his eyes scanning the printed numbers. Beside him, Cheryl turned around from the window. She saw the paper, and I watched the color, the pale, carefully applied pink on her cheeks, drain out of her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. "What is this, Mitchell?" I asked. My voice was very quiet, very low, but it filled the room like cold water rising. Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat making a dry, clicking sound. He didn't look at me. He looked at the name Apex Recovery and Acquisitions as if he hoped the ink would fade if he stared at it long enough. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. It's a line of credit. It's separate." $82,000, I said. "You defaulted on a second mortgage last month, Mitchell, and you didn't tell me." "It's not a second mortgage," Cheryl snapped, her voice rising in pitch, her fingers curling into her palms. "It's a home equity line. We used it to consolidate some business expenses. It has nothing to do with the primary loan." "Business expenses, Cheryl?" I asked, looking at her. "Or was it the online clothing boutique you tried to start last year? The one with the silk scarves and the Italian leather bags that you kept in the guest room until the boxes started to smell like mildew?" Cheryl flinched as if I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, but she couldn't find the words to cover the hole. "We were going to pay it back, Mom," Mitchell said, his voice desperate, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the yellow paper. "Cheryl's boutique. We thought it would take off. We thought we'd be able to clear the line of credit within 6 months. And then the layoff happened, and the interest rate on the line went from 5% to 11%. We couldn't keep up. And the lender has already filed a default notice, I said, reading from the paper. They aren't looking to foreclose, Mitchell. Raymond says they're looking to sell the debt to a private collection agency. Do you know what that means? Mitchell didn't answer. He just stared at his shoes. It means they don't want the house, I said. They want the money. And they will file a personal judgment against both of you. They will garnish your bank accounts. They will garnish whatever severance pay you have left. They will put a lien on this property that makes my 60% worth nothing, because we won't be able to sell or transfer a single foot of this land until that $82,000 is paid. We didn't know they'd file so quickly, Cheryl whispered, her voice dropping into a flat, hard tone of absolute denial. The representative on the phone, she told me we had until the end of the year to restructure. She lied to me. No, Cheryl, I said. She didn't lie to you. She just spoke the language you've been speaking for 5 years. She told you what you wanted to hear, so she could get you off the phone while her legal department prepared the paperwork. I sat down at the table. The wood felt cold under my hands. I looked at my son, and for the first time in my life, I felt a quiet, devastating sense of pity for him that had no love left in it. He was a 40-year-old boy who had spent his entire life running from the bill, and now the table was empty and there was nowhere left to run. "We don't have $82,000, Mom," Mitchell whispered, his shoulders shaking, his eyes wet. "We don't have anything left." "I know," I said. Before either of them could speak, the sound of a heavy, unfamiliar vehicle rumbled through the driveway outside. It wasn't Mitchell's SUV. It was a larger, louder engine. Through the leaded glass window of the dining room, I saw the reflection of a dark, dirty sedan pulling up behind Mitchell's car, blocking it in. The engine died with a wet, heavy cough. We all sat frozen in the dining room, the silence in the house turning thick and suffocating. Through the glass, I saw a man in a dark canvas jacket get out of the sedan. He was carrying a small black clipboard and a white plastic bag. He didn't walk up to the front door. He walked around the side of the house, his boots scraping against the gravel path that led to the basement entrance. My entrance. The doorbell downstairs rang. It was a loud, flat buzz that vibrated through the floorboards beneath our feet. The flat, heavy buzz of the basement doorbell rang a second time. It was a short, angry sound that rattled the small copper pipes behind my kitchen sink. "Mitchell," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the dining room, "go downstairs." Mitchell didn't move. He sat with his hands gripped between his knees, his face white, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He looked at the floorboards as if he expected them to open up and swallow him. "I'll go," Cheryl whispered. She made a move toward the stairs, but her knees seemed to give way, and she had to catch herself against the oak sideboard. The pink nails of her right hand scraped against the wood, making a dry, scratching sound. "No," I said, standing up. I'll open my own door, but both of you are coming with me." I walked down the stairs, the wood creaking under my slippers. I didn't look back to see if they were following, but I could hear the heavy, hesitant step of Mitchell behind me and the light, dry rustle of Cheryl's cashmere sweater. They walked close together, like children hiding behind their mother's skirt. I opened the heavy wooden door that led out to the small concrete patio. The November air rushed in, cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and decaying oak leaves. The man standing on the patio was tall, with a thick neck and a dark canvas jacket that had a grease stain on the right pocket. He had a black clipboard tucked under his arm and a large, thick manila envelope in his hand. He looked at me, his eyes tired and indifferent, the eyes of a man who spent his days delivering bad news to strangers. "Lorraine Miller?" he asked, his voice flat. "I am Lorraine," I said. "I have a service of process for Mitchell Miller and Cheryl Miller," he said, checking his clipboard. "Are they here?" Mitchell stepped forward from the shadow of the staircase. He looked small, his shoulders hunched, his hands tucked into his pockets to hide their shaking. "I'm Mitchell," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. The man didn't look at him. He simply slid a pink carbon sheet from his clipboard, handed the thick manila envelope to Mitchell, and held out a black ballpoint pen. "Sign at the bottom," the man said. Mitchell took the pen. His hand was trembling so hard he had to press his wrist against the clipboard to steady it. He scribbled his name, his signature looking like a jagged, broken fence on the yellow paper. He handed the pen and the clipboard back. The man took them, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and turned without a word. He walked back up the gravel path, his heavy boots kicking up small gray stones that hit the side of the house with a series of quiet, sharp clicks. A moment later, the dirty sedan's engine roared to life, and the car backed down the driveway, leaving only the smell of cheap exhaust hanging in the cold air. Humiliation is a quiet thing. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet. It comes in a manila envelope, delivered by a stranger who doesn't even bother to take his boots off on your rug. We went back into my sitting room. Mitchell sat on the edge of my bed, the thick envelope resting in his hands as if it were a bomb. Cheryl stood by the door, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Open it, Mitchell," I said. With a slow, tearing sound, Mitchell ripped the top of the envelope. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, the pages held together by a heavy blue paper backing, the signature mark of the Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. He read the first page in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the print. "It's a lawsuit," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They're suing us for $82,000, plus interest, plus $12,000 in attorney's fees. We have 20 days to file an answer. If we don't, they get a default judgment." "They'll garnish your accounts," I said. "They'll take the SUV." "We have to file bankruptcy," Cheryl said, her voice rising in pitch, her eyes wide and wild. "Mitchell, we have to call a bankruptcy lawyer. We can file Chapter 7. We can wipe the debt." "You can't file Chapter 7, Cheryl," I said. "Not if you want to keep this house. If you file bankruptcy, the trustee will look at this property. They will see that you sold it to Mitchell for $92,000 when it was worth $400,000. They will call that a fraudulent transfer to avoid creditors. They will void the deed. They will sell this house at auction to pay your credit cards, and all of us, including Leo, will be out on the street by February." Cheryl stared at me, her mouth open, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Then what do we do? We can't pay $82,000. We don't have $82. "No," I said, "you don't. But I have the 60% of this house, and I have Raymond Vance. And starting today, we are going to change the way this family lives." I walked over to the small table and stood between them. "If you want to stay in this house, Cheryl," I said, "if you want my $38,000 to keep the primary mortgage from foreclosing while Mitchell finds a job, you are going to accept my rules, all of them." Cheryl's eyes narrowed, her pink lips tightening. "What rules?" "First, Mitchell," I said, looking at my son, "on Monday morning, you are going to take the SUV to the dealer. You will sell it. You will buy a 10-year-old sedan that runs on regular gas, and the difference will go into the grocery fund. Second, Cheryl, you are going to cancel your subscription boxes, your meal services, your house cleaner, and your salon appointments. You will help me cook, and we will eat dinner at the table, all 4 of us. And third," I looked at both of them, my voice dropping into a register that was as hard and cold as the stone foundation behind me. "You are going to go out to the garage, Mitchell. You are going to take the tarp off your father's cedar chest, and you and Cheryl are going to carry it back inside, up the stairs, and put it back in the front hall where it belongs." Cheryl flinched, her eyes filling with a sudden dark hatred. "You're humiliating us," she whispered. "No, Cheryl," I said, my voice level and quiet. "I'm dismantling your lies. I'm making this house look like a family lives in it again. If you want to keep the walls, you're going to have to live with the people who built them." Mitchell looked at the legal papers in his hand, then up at his wife. He didn't look angry. To my surprise, his face held a sudden, devastating sense of relief. The look of a drowning man who had finally been told where the bottom was, even if the water was still up to his chin. "I'll get the chest, Mom," Mitchell said quietly. He stood up and walked toward the stairs. Cheryl stared after him, her body rigid, her eyes wide with a cold, terrifying sense of absolute isolation. She realized in that single second that her husband had just handed me the keys to her castle. The sound of the cedar chest returning was a slow, agonizing process. I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs and listened to it. Mitchell had to drag it across the gravel path, the wood scraping against the stones with a harsh, grinding noise. But when he reached the 3 wooden steps that led to the kitchen porch, he couldn't lift it alone. The red cedar was too dense, the wrought iron hinges too heavy. "Cheryl," I heard his voice come through the window, muffled and breathless. "Grab the other end. I can't get it over the lip of the door." There was a long silence. I imagined Cheryl standing on the porch, her cashmere-clad arms crossed, looking at the dirty wood and the bricks Mitchell had used to weight down the tarp. She had spent 5 years trying to turn this house into a page from a design catalog, and now she was being asked to carry the heavy, unvarnished past back through her front door. "Cheryl," Mitchell pleaded, his voice cracking with exhaustion, "please." Then came the sharp, angry scuff of her shoes against the porch steps. A moment later, the heavy thud of the chest hitting the kitchen floor echoed through my ceiling. They dragged it through the kitchen, across the new bamboo flooring, and finally into the foyer, where it settled with a deep, resonant thump that felt like the house's heartbeat returning to normal. When you open a cedar chest that has been closed for months, the smell doesn't just fill the room, it cuts through everything else: the fresh latex paint, the chemical floor polish, the expensive lavender sprays. It smells of 60 years of winter mornings, mothballs, and the heavy, greasy wool of coats that had kept 3 generations of millers warm. On Sunday evening, we sat at the oak dining table. It was the first time in 5 years we had all eaten together without Cheryl's work friends or her elaborate organic menus. I had made a simple pork roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe Curtis's mother had taught me in 1975. The smell of the roasting pork and onions had filled the house since 3 p.m, thick and rich. Leo sat next to me, his fork hovering over his plate. He looked at the potato on his dish, then up at me, his gray eyes bright. "This smells like Grandpa's kitchen," he said. "It is Grandpa's kitchen, Leo," I said, cutting his meat into small, manageable pieces. "We just painted the walls." Cheryl sat opposite me. She hadn't changed out of her silk blouse, but she had pushed her sleeves up to her elbows. Her plate was mostly untouched, her fork tracing small, neat circles in the gravy. She looked at her husband, who was eating with a slow, mechanical intensity. The look of a man who hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food was in front of him. "Mitchell," Cheryl said, her voice quiet but sharp enough to draw his eyes from his plate. "Did you call the dealer about the SUV?" Mitchell chewed slowly, swallowed, and wiped his mouth with his napkin. He didn't look at her. He looked at his water glass. "I did. They're giving us $18,000. That's enough to pay off the remaining loan balance and leave us with about $4,000 in cash. I'm looking at a 2014 Honda Civic on Monday afternoon." Cheryl's fork clicked sharply against her plate. "A Civic, Mitchell? My sister's husband drives a Civic. He's an assistant manager at a grocery store." "He has a job, Cheryl," Mitchell said. His voice was flat, devoid of any anger, which made the words hit the table with the weight of cold iron. "Right now, the assistant manager at the grocery store is making $4,000 a month more than I am." Cheryl went completely still. She looked at him as if he had just spoken in a language she didn't understand. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a cold, glittering resentment, then stood up from the table without clearing her plate. "I'm going to put Leo to bed," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper that was almost a hiss. "I want Grandma to read to me," Leo said, looking up from his carrots. "No, Leo," Cheryl said, her hand coming down on his shoulder, her grip looking slightly too tight. "Grandma is tired. She's had a very busy week. Come on." She led him out of the room. As the kitchen door swung shut behind them, the house went quiet again, save for the ticking of the clock in the hall. At 9:30, I went down to my apartment. I turned off the lamps, leaving only the small nightlight in the utility room, and lay down on top of my quilt. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a soft, hesitant knock on my basement door, the one that led into the utility room. I stood up, wrapping my wool shawl tightly around my shoulders, and opened the door. Cheryl was standing there. She had taken off her silk blouse and was wearing a simple gray sweatshirt, but her face was still hard, her lips set in that thin, dark line. She didn't have her navy blue folder. She didn't look like a manager tonight. She looked like a woman who had come to the end of her rope and was looking for someone to tie it to. "Can I come in, Lorraine?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet, very level. "Come in, Cheryl," I said, stepping aside. She walked into my small sitting room and stood in the center of the braided rug, her eyes scanning the neat stacks of books, the old framed photographs, the wingback chairs. She looked as if she were trying to find some weakness in the room, some crack in the stone. "Mitchell is sleeping," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's exhausted. He's been sleeping 12 hours a day since the layoff." "He's depressed, Cheryl," I said. "He's carrying a very heavy load." "And you think I'm not?" she asked, turning to face me. Her eyes were bright with a sudden, sharp anger that she was trying desperately to keep behind her teeth. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted $60,000 in credit card debt? I did it for this family, Lorraine. I did it so we wouldn't look like we were failing. I did it so Mitchell wouldn't feel the pinch of the mill his whole life." "You did it for yourself, Cheryl," I said gently. "You wanted the life in the magazines, but you wanted to pay for it with Curtis's house." Cheryl took a step closer, her body rigid. "You think you've won, don't you? You think because you have 60% of the deed, you're the matriarch again. You think Mitchell is going to sit at this table and eat your cabbage and potatoes for the rest of his life." "I don't care about winning, Cheryl," I said. "I care about having a roof over my head that doesn't leak because my son sold it." "Then you'd better think about what that roof is holding up," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical whisper that made my chest tighten. "Because if you file that deed on Monday morning, Lorraine, I'm leaving." I stared at her. "What?" "I'm leaving Mitchell," she said, her face looking pale and sharp in the dim light. "My sister has a condo in Chicago. She's already spoken to a family lawyer for me. I'm taking Leo, and I'm moving. Mitchell is weak. He'll sign whatever custody agreement I put in front of him because he's too tired to fight me. If you put your name on that deed, Lorraine, you'll have your house back, but you'll be sitting in this basement completely alone, and you will never see Leo again." The basement was completely silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic clack-tick of the water heater in the utility room, cooling down after the evening dishes. I looked at Cheryl. She stood in the center of my small braided rug, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Her threat hung in the cool air between us, heavy and sharp as a butcher's knife. She was using her own 6-year-old son, the boy who still slept with a green plastic dinosaur under his pillow, as a bargaining chip in a real estate transaction. I felt a quiet, deep sadness for her, not because she was losing, but because her pride was so immense, so diseased, that she would rather tear her own family to pieces than admit to her sister that she had to live in a house she didn't own. The most dangerous thing you can do to a proud person is to describe their reality back to them without the adjectives. "Your sister Marianne," I said, My voice was very calm, very steady. Her husband, Calvin. He's the assistant manager at the Jewel Osco on Western Avenue in Chicago, isn't he? Cheryl's eyes widened, a tiny nervous muscle twitching beneath her left eyelid. What does Calvin have to do with this? And they live in that brick 2-bedroom near the elevated train in Rogers Park? I continued, not letting her look away. The one where Marianne told me 3 years ago that the windows rattle so hard during the evening rush hour that she has to tape the tea glasses to the shelves. Cheryl swallowed, her throat making a dry clicking sound. You aren't going to Chicago, Cheryl, I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. You can't afford the gas to get to the Pennsylvania border. How are you going to pay the retainer for a custody lawyer? With the credit cards that the bank is freezing next week? Is Marianne going to pay for it? With Calvin's salary from the grocery store? They have 3 children of their own, Cheryl. They're still paying off the hospital bill from when their oldest had her tonsils out. I have friends, Cheryl whispered, but the word friends sounded hollow, like a dry leaf falling onto concrete. I have people who would help me. The people from the country club? I asked. The ones who didn't invite you to the autumn luncheon last month because they already heard Mitchell was no longer at the logistics firm? Those friends, Cheryl? They don't lend money to people who are 3 months behind on their mortgage. They just watch them from across the pool and whisper about how far they've fallen. Cheryl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The elegant, high-control mask she had worn like a shield for 5 years was starting to crack, the gray, terrified face of a bankrupt woman showing through the fissures. If you leave Mitchell, I said, standing up from my chair and taking a step toward her, you will be doing it with $80,000 of credit card debt in your name. You will be doing it with no job, no reference letters, and no home. If you take Leo out of this school district without Mitchell's consent, Raymond Vance will have a court order signed by a judge before your sister's train reaches Ohio. You won't be living in a condo in Chicago, Cheryl. You'll be living in a rooming house in Pittsburgh, waiting for a court-appointed mediator to tell you when you're allowed to see your son. You're a monster, she whispered, her voice trembling so hard the words were barely recognizable. You've always hated me. You've been waiting for this. No, Cheryl, I said. I didn't wait for anything. I spent 40 years keeping this house safe so my son would always have a place to come back to. You're the one who brought the wolf to the door. I'm just the one who's refusing to let it eat the boy. Before Cheryl could speak, the cellar door behind her, the one at the top of the dark wooden stairs, creaked open. Neither of us had heard it. The steps in this house were old, but Mitchell had lived here his whole life. He knew exactly where to place his feet to avoid the squeaks. He stood on the 4th step from the bottom, his large frame shadowed by the dim light from the kitchen above. He was wearing his old gray sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. His eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a quiet, devastating fury I had never seen in him before. He had heard everything. "Mitchell!" Cheryl gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she spun around. "Mitchell, I was just talking to her. I was just trying to find a way." "You were going to take Leo?" Mitchell asked. His voice was very low, very dry, carrying the rasp of his father's voice when Curtis was at his most serious. "Mitchell, no," she said, taking a step toward the stairs, her hands reaching out to him. "You don't understand. She's taking 60% of the house. She's stripping us of everything. I was just trying to protect our family." "Our family?" Mitchell said. He stepped down onto the concrete floor of the basement, his boots hitting the rug with a heavy, dead sound. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me, then at the blue passbook from the credit union that was still sitting flat on my table. "My father worked 44 hours of overtime in the winter of 1989 so I wouldn't feel the cold," Mitchell said, his voice shaking with a deep, long-buried grief that had finally found its way to the surface. "And you were going to use my son to buy your credit cards back?" "Mitchell, please," Cheryl cried, her voice cracking into a sob. "On Monday morning, Mom is filing the deed," Mitchell said, his face looking hard, his jaw set in a line that looked exactly like Curtis's. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in his marriage, his eyes held no fear of her anger. "And if you want to go to Chicago, Cheryl, you go alone." The Allegheny County Courthouse on Grant Street is a massive, dark granite fortress built in the late 19th century. Its vaulted stone corridors always smell of wet wool, floor wax, and 60 years of old paper. Mitchell and I arrived at 9:30 on Monday morning. He drove his large SUV, his fingers gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel in silence as we crossed the bridge into the city. It was the last time he would drive that car. We had already scheduled the drop-off at the dealership for 11 o'clock. We walked into the Recorder of Deeds office on the second floor. The room was loud with the hum of copy machines and the low, hurried murmurs of title searchers. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a tray of blue ink stamps. She didn't look at us as she took the modification document Raymond Vance had drafted. She checked the signatures, verified the notary's seal, and then pressed a heavy metal recording stamp down onto the paper with a sharp, dual clank-clank. The sound was remarkably small, but it felt like the closing of a heavy oak door. 60%, the clerk muttered, typing the registration number into her computer. "Lorraine Miller, primary trustee. That'll be $84 for the filing fee." I paid her in cash, 4 $20 bills and a 5, the bills crisp and clean from my purse. The most painful part of returning to your mother's house as an adult is realizing that the lock you broke as a teenager was the only thing keeping the world from breaking you. You spent your youth trying to build a castle of your own, only to realize that the only walls that will keep out the storm are the ones your parents paid for in sweat. At 11:15, we stood in the gravel lot of the used car dealership off Route 8. The dealer took the keys to Mitchell's SUV, and in exchange, they handed us the keys to a 2014 gray Honda Civic with 78,000 miles on the odometer. It had a small scratch on the rear passenger door and a plastic steering wheel that felt cold and hard. It smelled faintly of stale pine air freshener and carpet cleaner. Mitchell sat in the driver's seat of the Civic, his knees high because the cabin was so much smaller than his old car. He adjusted the mirror, started the engine, which gave a light, high-pitched whir instead of the deep rumble of his old V8, and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the wheel. "It's a good car, Mitchell," I said, putting my seatbelt on. "It'll get you where you need to go." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. He looked out the window at the dealership lot, where his old SUV was already being parked in the front row with a bright yellow "For Sale" sign tucked into the windshield. It's real now. Everything is real." "It's always been real, Mitchell," I said gently. "You were just paying a lot of money to pretend it wasn't." He nodded slowly, shifted the car into drive, and we pulled out onto the highway. When we returned to the house at 1 o'clock, the driveway felt strangely empty. The gray Civic looked small and insignificant, sitting near the oak tree where the large SUV used to block the view of the garden. The front door was unlocked. As we stepped into the foyer, the scent of the house hit us. The smell of the cedar chest in the hallway was strong now, a clean, sharp forest air that had completely taken over the space, burying the scent of the muted linen paint. Cheryl was sitting in the living room. She was sitting in the corner of the gray linen sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs. She was wearing her gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She wasn't typing on her laptop. She wasn't organizing her files. She was simply staring at the cold, empty fireplace. She didn't look up when the front door closed. She didn't look at Mitchell when he set the Civic keys on the cherry sideboard. Mitchell walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee. I followed him, wanting to help him find the mugs, which Cheryl had moved to a higher cabinet 3 months ago to make room for her imported tea glasses. As the water began to heat, Mitchell pulled his phone from his pocket. He needed to transfer the $500 cancellation fee to the estate appraiser's office, as Raymond had instructed. I watched his face. He was staring at the screen of his phone, his thumb hovering over the glass. His brow furrowed, his eyes moving rapidly across the display. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The kitchen was completely silent, save for the slow, wet gasp of the coffee maker in the corner. "Mitchell?" I asked. "What is it?" He slowly lowered the phone, his face turning a gray, greasy color in the white LED light of the kitchen. He looked at me, his eyes wide, wet, and filled with a sudden, absolute terror that made my stomach drop. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The checking account." "The joint account." "What about it, Mitchell?" "It's empty," he said, his hand shaking so hard the phone nearly slipped from his fingers. "The $18,000 from the dealer. They wired the $4,000 cash difference into our joint account at 9:30 this morning. And my remaining severance pay of $1,200. All of it. It was in there." He turned the screen toward me. The balance on the screen read $12.42. I looked down the list of transactions. At 9:45, there had been a single manual wire transfer withdrawal for $5,200. The recipient was listed as Goldstein and Associates, LLC. I stood very still, the smell of the hot coffee suddenly making me feel sick. Goldstein and Associates. They were a prominent family law and divorce firm in the city, with offices in the Frick Building. I turned around and looked through the open doorway of the kitchen. Cheryl was still sitting on the gray linen sofa. She had slowly lowered her legs, her feet flat on the floor now, her hands resting on her knees. She was looking at us through the doorway, her face pale, her lips painted that dark, hard red. She didn't look angry. She didn't look frightened. Her eyes were completely cold, filled with a quiet, triumphant malice that made her look like a stranger. "Cheryl," Mitchell whispered, stepping into the living room, his voice trembling. "What did you do? Where is the money from the SUV?" Cheryl slowly stood up from the sofa. She smoothed her gray sweatshirt with her hands, her pink fingernails catching the light. I paid my retainer, Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying a flat, clinical calm that was more terrifying than any scream. Mr. Goldstein's office is filing the divorce petition tomorrow morning. And since you've signed 60% of the house over to your mother, I'm suing you for the cash value of my 40% share. She took a step closer, her eyes fixed on me. Your mother can keep her bricks, Mitchell, she said, her voice dropping into a whisper. But she's going to have to buy me out to keep them. Mr. Goldstein says my share is worth $160,000. And if you don't pay me by the end of the year, the court will force a partition sale of this entire property to give me my money. Mitchell didn't yell. He didn't move toward his wife. Instead, his knees seemed to lose their strength, and he sat down heavily in the oak chair near the kitchen doorway, the same chair where his father had sat 40 years ago to write out the mortgage checks. He held his phone in his hand, his thumb still resting on the glass screen that showed $12.42. He looked like a man who had been struck by a silent, invisible blow, his chest barely moving as he breathed. Cheryl stood in the center of the living room, her chin tilted upward, her eyes fixed on me. The pale plaster mask of her face was rigid. She had spent 5 years treating this family like an inefficient business, and now she had finally delivered her final liquidation plan. $160,000, I said. My voice was very low, very quiet, but it filled the cold room like the hum of a winter furnace. That's 40% of 400,000, Cheryl. You're very good at the simple math. It's not simple, she said, her voice carrying a hard defensive edge. The house was appraised at $420 last spring. I'm being generous. Mr. Goldstein says a judge will look at my contribution to this household, my management of the remodel, my handling of the bills, and they will award me at least 40% of the market value. You can't keep me here, Lorraine, and you can't keep my money. I don't want to keep your money, Cheryl, I said, taking a step toward her. But I think you forgot to tell Mr. Goldstein about the ledger. Cheryl's eyes narrowed, her pink polished fingernails digging into her palms. What ledger? The one at the courthouse, I said, the one we just came from. You see, when a court orders a partition sale of a house, they don't just divide the bricks, they pay the debts first. She went completely still, her breath catching in her throat. The primary mortgage is $92,000, I said, my voice steady, my eyes holding hers. That has to be paid to the bank before anyone gets a penny. The second line of credit, the $82,000 you took from Apex Recovery, has to be paid next. That's $174,000 in debt secured by this property. I took another step closer until I could see the tiny lines of tension around her dark red lips. $400,000 minus $174,000 is $226,000, I said. That is the actual equity of this house, Cheryl. Your 40% of that equity is $90,000, not $160,000. That's still my money, she whispered, her voice dropping into a register that was thin and watery. I'm entitled to it. And then there is the credit card debt, I continued, not letting her look away. The $80,000 you ran up in Mitchell's name to buy your silk scarves and your expensive furniture. In Pennsylvania, marital debt is divided during a divorce, Cheryl. If Mitchell's lawyer shows the court that those cards were used for a business that was solely in your name, a judge will deduct that $80,000 from your share of the equity. I looked down at the crumpled pink ball of the adhesive dot she had left on the side table. So, I said quietly, $90,000 minus $80,000 is $10,000. That is what you are actually owed, Cheryl. And you just spent $5,200 of our last remaining cash, the cash from the car Mitchell sold to buy our groceries, to hire a lawyer to sue us for $10,000. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and devastating. Mitchell raised his head from his hands. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in his life, his face held no fear of her, no desire to smooth things over. His eyes were completely dry, filled with a quiet, hollow pity that was worse than any anger. "You spent the grocery money, Cheryl?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "To buy a lawsuit?" Cheryl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The calculation behind her gray eyes was no longer about victory. It was about survival. She had spent 5 years believing she was the smartest person in the room because she spoke the language of boundaries and asset management. And now she was standing in an empty house with $10,000 in equity and $80,000 in personal debt. The most dangerous thing about a desperate person's plan is that they only calculate their victory, never their liabilities. They build their traps for others, forgetting that they have to live inside the same walls. Before Cheryl could speak, the front doorbell rang. It was a sharp, loud chime that vibrated through the quiet foyer. We all stood frozen in the living room. Mitchell didn't move. He sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. I walked into the hallway, my slippers making a slow, soft sound on the oak floor. I opened the heavy front door. A young man in a dark blue windbreaker was standing on the porch. He was holding a white overnight courier envelope and a silver digital signature pad. "Mitchell Miller?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm his mother, but he's inside." "I need a signature for this," he said, handing me the pad. "It's from the Court of Common Pleas." I took the stylus, signed my name, and handed the pad back. He handed me the thick white envelope and turned, walking quickly down the steps to his van. I closed the door and walked back into the living room. I didn't hand the envelope to Mitchell. I opened it myself. Inside was a single, thick document with a blue backing. But it wasn't the divorce petition from Goldstein and Associates. It was a writ of execution from the Allegheny County Sheriff's Department, issued on behalf of Apex Recovery and Acquisitions. I read the second page, my eyes scanning the dense legal print. "What is it, Mom?" Mitchell asked, his voice flat. "It's a confession of judgment," I said, my voice sounding cold and distant, even to me. "The line of credit you signed with Apex? It had a confession clause. It means that if you defaulted, they didn't have to go to trial, Mitchell. They didn't have to wait for 20 days for an answer. They entered a judgment immediately." I looked at Cheryl, whose face had gone the color of damp salt. "And," I said, "the sheriff has scheduled a levy on the personal property inside this house. They are coming on Thursday morning to inventory everything we own, the furniture, the kitchen appliances, your grandmother's cedar chest, to be sold at a public auction on the front lawn." The sheriff's deputy arrived on Thursday morning, just as the cold November fog was beginning to lift from the backyard. He was an older man with graying temples and a quiet, respectful manner. He didn't carry a clipboard. He carried a small leather folder. He stood in the foyer, his eyes resting on the heavy cedar chest that now sat firmly in the center of the hallway. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice low, "but I have a writ to execute. I need to catalog the personal property of Mitchell and Cheryl Miller." "I understand, Deputy," I said, standing by the banister. "But before you begin, I need you to look at this." I handed him the copy of the new deed, stamped and recorded on Monday morning by the county, along with the lifetime tenancy agreement Raymond Vance had prepared. Raymond stepped out of the dining room, his boots making a slow, steady sound on the oak floor. He had his reading glasses perched on his nose and a legal brief in his hand. "Deputy," Raymond said, his voice dry and authoritative, "as you can see, 60% of the beneficial interest in this property and 100% of the primary tenancy of the lower level and common areas belongs to Lorraine Miller. She is not a debtor on the apex judgment. Under Pennsylvania law, you cannot levy on or seize any personal property that is jointly held in a primary trust, nor can you enter the primary tenant's designated spaces." The deputy took the papers, adjusted his glasses, and read them in silence. He looked at the deed, the county recorder's stamp, and then at the foyer around him. He looked at the cherry sideboard, the grandfather clock, and the cedar chest. "So," the deputy said, looking at Raymond, "the debtors only own 40% of the equity, and it's tied to a primary trust?" "Exactly," Raymond said. "If Apex wants to satisfy their $82,000 judgment, they will have to sue to force a partition. But since Lorraine holds 60% and has a lifetime, non-revocable lease, any buyer at a sheriff's sale would have to buy the house with her living in the basement forever. No bank will finance that, and no developer will touch it." The deputy closed his leather folder. A very small, quiet smile touched his lips. He looked at Mitchell, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and then at Cheryl, who was leaning against the wall, her face the color of dry salt. "Well," the deputy said, "it looks like I have nothing to inventory today. I'll file my return with the court, stating that the debtor's property is shielded by a primary trust." He nodded to me, turned, and walked out the door, his boots making a soft, fading sound on the porch steps. The private equity firm in Delaware had no interest in a 10-year legal battle over a house they couldn't sell. By Friday afternoon, their lawyers called Raymond Vance. They agreed to settle the entire $82,000 debt for a single lump sum payment of $18,000, the exact amount I had left in my St. Patrick's Credit Union passbook. But I didn't give them the money for free. To get the $18,000 to clear the lien, Mitchell and Cheryl had to sign a final agreement. They had to transfer their remaining 40% share of the house to me. On Saturday morning, they signed the papers. The house at 1412 Maple Lane was now 100% mine. Cheryl left on Sunday. She didn't go to Chicago. Her sister Marianne's 2-bedroom apartment near the elevated train was too small, and Calvin's grocery store salary couldn't pay for her pride. Instead, she rented a tiny 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's in the valley, a place where the windows smelled of chemical steam and the rent was $600 a month. She packed her designer bags in silence. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply walked down the stairs, her heels making a hollow, scraping sound on the oak floor, and left her key on the cherry sideboard. She left Leo behind. She couldn't afford to feed him, and her new apartment didn't have a yard. That evening, the house was completely quiet. I sat in the kitchen making a pot of tea. The smell of the cedar chest in the hall was warm and thick, filling the rooms with the scent of 40 years of safety. Mitchell came into the kitchen. He was wearing his old gray flannel shirt, and his face looked tired, but the gray, greasy look of panic was gone. He sat at the table, opened his laptop, and began to fill out an application for a logistics position at a shipping terminal in the valley. He didn't hide in the library parking lot anymore. He sat where I could see him. Leo was sitting on the floor by the cedar chest, playing with his green plastic dinosaur. The tail was still straight, held together by the thin, hard line of Curtis's old yellow wood glue. "Grandma?" Leo called out, looking up at me. "Is the winter coming?" "Yes, Leo," I said, carrying the tea to the table. "The winter is coming." "Will we be warm?" I looked at my son, who was typing slowly on his computer, and then at the sturdy red cedar chest that had survived 70 years of cold. "Yes, sweet pea," I whispered. "We will be warm. The foundation is fixed." Sometimes karma isn't a loud, dramatic reckoning. It is a quiet ledger being closed in a silent room. It is the slow, steady turning of the wheel until everyone is sitting in the seat they actually built for themselves. If you found comfort in this quiet victory of patience and truth over pride, we invite you to join our family. Please consider subscribing to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we share the narratives of those who remember, those who endure, and the quiet, inevitable justice that time always delivers. Thank you for listening, and may your own home always be built on a foundation that stands.